these Gospels of Thomas, of Mary, and of Peter that were discovered elsewhere. These are, for example, like we discussed with the Book of Maccabees, texts that are not included in Christian canon that form the Bible, but were still circulating in antiquity. Then we have the Church Fathers, and of course they have the disadvantage of being written so much later and essentially relying on the kind of materials that we still have preserved, and in some cases perhaps material that has been lost. And finally we have the Talmud that again is written much later, a few hundred years after the events described, and although they may rely on oral traditions as well, one of the important things about understanding the Talmud as a historical source is that, you know, the rabbis in the Talmud, it's not really fair to ask them to teach us history. They're trying to teach us religion, specifically Judaism, and so they're saying much about how Judaism views Jesus, again, at some distance, and perhaps in an allegorical manner, and so on. But anyway, when we pull those things together as best we can, this is what we have as a scholarly consensus. And note, I'm talking now about a scholarly consensus, not necessarily that of a believer. As we have with Jews who revere the Hebrew scriptures as, you know, inspired word of God in one form or another, the assessment of the validity and specifically the historicity of the texts we're describing for Christians depends a lot on how you approach those texts. So if we boil down to just what scholars agree on, they basically say the following. There's general consensus that Jesus was a historical person who actually lived somewhere between 6 before the Common Era until about the year 26 to 36 of the Common Era. And for those of you who may not have watched some of these previous videos, let me mention that the terms BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, generally replace before Christ and Anno Domini, BC and AD, because this is a term used generally by secular scholars or by non-Christian scholars. So please don't be offended by it. That is actually a scholarly norm. So we know roughly when he lived. We can patch these things together from, you know, Roman records and other Judean sources and so on. We know that he spent his youth in Nazareth, which is in the Galilee region. We know that he was baptized by John the Baptist. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about the relationship between them, but again, not for this video. We know that he debated and taught religion and morality with other Jews primarily. And you can see in this map here some of his adult ministry in the region from Hebron in the south up to Sidon in the north. Most of his audiences were Jewish, although there were a few that were distinctly non-Jewish. It's also a discussion of his time in Egypt as a child, but his primary adult work is in Israel. And finally, he was crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate, the procurator who we spoke about in the previous lecture. That's basically what we know. What we don't know is huge, and specifically when we try to understand it in the context of his Jewish community, because he was a first-century Jew. How did his community understand what he was saying? We don't know, for example, what exactly was his relationship to the Torah and to Judaism. What was his relationship to the seething political ferment of the day? And what was his relationship to Jews vis-a-vis his relationship to non-Jews or Gentiles? Really big questions. Let me give you a couple of examples of why we don't really know and what are kind of the parameters of the debate. Let us recall that the teachings of Jesus that we have today do not come to us unmediated from a first century Jewish source. They primarily come to us through Greek translations of what Jesus would have said. He would have spoken Aramaic, perhaps a little bit of Koine, which is kind of like a Greek, not exactly a dialect, but a form of Greek, let's say, that was common throughout the region. But the texts that we have are all in Greek. And when you translate a text, you ipso facto must distort it. and especially cultures so radically different as the culture of Athens and the culture of Jerusalem. We spoke about this a little bit when we talked about the Maccabean revolt, and actually there's a video that I think I titled Athens and Jerusalem that talks a little bit about how they see things differently. So just in one example though, in Jerusalem, Jews understood the model of a prophet, the holy man who came with a rebuke from God and was sending a message, because otherwise God would get involved in history. Like consider, for example, God speaks to Jonah and says, get thee to Nineveh in Babylonia and tell those people that they're going to be destroyed. And there's a whole story there that's fascinating. Athens, on the other hand, has much of a model of the holy man who is a philosopher like Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, that is maybe distinct from the world, that contemplates the forms and the ideals and does not necessarily engage in the world and does not come with a burning message that God wants people to behave differently. So a lot of things that change as the authors of the texts in the New Testament convey these ideas to a Greek audience. Furthermore, who exactly is writing these things down? And do they have a specific agenda is tied to who's listening? Paul in particular is especially important depending on who he is speaking to. And we'll look at a couple of examples. So trying to understand Jesus' teachings in Jewish context, let's look at those three areas that we identified a minute ago. First of all, on Torah and Judaism. In some passages in the Gospels in particular, you have debate between sometimes rabbis and Jesus about specific practices, such as, for example, hand washing. Now, if you are not familiar with Jewish practice and you read it, you would say, what is this? Why are there hands before they eat? Doesn't everybody wash their hands before they eat? Are they insinuating or something? Is this hygiene? Of course, you understand it within the Jewish context right away that they're not talking washing one's hands free. They're talking about whether or not Jesus submits himself to the rabbinic law, in which there is a specific rule laid down, a halakha, that says that before you say the blessing over bread, you wash your hands in a ritual. Long discussion about why that is. It was really a marker, affiliation with the Jewish community, and with the authority of the rabbis to agree to that practice. There's a famous passage in the Talmud in which Rabbi Akiva is imprisoned by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and he's only given a very small measure of water, and he insists on some of that water aside to fulfill this particular commandment of the rabbi because he respects rabbinic authority so much. So about hand washing and about other issues like cleaning on Shabbat and so on. But they're trying to find out, are you part of the Pharisaic community, or do you submit to it, or do you not? And some of the answers that Jesus provides suggest that he is not. Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, things like that. On the other hand, there are passages like Matthew 5:17 in which he says, I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. By the way, the law is one attempt in Greek to translate Torah. And of course, in the Hebrew context, Torah, with the root of which means the teaching, as it were, is much larger than the law. In fact, law in form of religion is a word that doesn't exist in Hebrew at all, at least not in biblical Hebrew. You have to use halakha, which means like the way, the path, the direction. The law is a novel idea that you have to use Greek to really express it. At any rate, so where is he? Is Jesus rebelling against rabbinical authority, or is he trying to support it, perhaps in a revolutionary way? There's a lot of ambiguity, and scholars debate it. Secondly, what about his political ideologies? We talked about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Zealots and so on. There's no question that Jesus is closest to the Pharisees in the sense that siblings will argue much more than strangers will, because siblings are closer and they care more about each other. And so it's not surprising to see that there's a lot of Pharisaic debate with Jesus over things like washing the hands and so on. There are some points in the Gospels where Jesus appears to take positions that are very close to the Pharisees, such as, for example, the idea of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, which seems to fit with the Pharisaic idea of, you know what, not going to defeat the Roman Empire. Let us just, pay our taxes and keep our heads down and occupy ourselves with our inner spiritual world. But on the other hand, he seems like a zealot, intent on disrupting the status quo, such as the dramatic moment in the temple courtyard in which he, overturned the tables and the money changers and things like that, which is, by the way, a widely passage too. So that would be much more of a zealotry kind of thing to do. By the way, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts specific passages and what could they possibly mean, I highly recommend the Jewish Annotated New Testament, published by Oxford University Press, which has some amazing essays at the back, which kind of give an overall context, and then, of course, the entire New Testament with lots of fantastically useful footnotes that will be especially helpful if you're not familiar with the larger Jewish context. I am familiar with the Jewish context, but not so much with the New Testament environment. Really enjoyed it as well. So politically, it's hard to place Jesus on the spectrum. Jews and Gentiles is fascinating. As I mentioned, the vast majority of people that Jesus interacted with, maybe less so when he went up to the region which is now Lebanon, but certainly in Judea, the vast majority of people he interacted with were Jews. What would he have said about Gentiles? We can read some things backwards from the later works. For example, a passage in Galatians 2, in which James, who is based in Jerusalem, is apparently placed in charge of gospel to the circumcised. And by the way, circumcised versus circumcised is sort of that it exists in Hebrew scriptures. James in Jerusalem is in charge of speaking to Jews, and Paul is placed in charge of a different gospel to the uncircumcised. And we presume it's a different gospel. And we see that there's some conflict occasionally about, how are these two populations supposed to interact? Should you have Jewish Christians, for example, sitting meal with Gentiles, meaning Christian believers who are of non-Jewish ethnic origin? And what does that mean in terms of the larger question of observance? Is Jesus talking about Christianity being Judaism plus, meaning that Jews should continue to observe the Sabbath, the dietary laws, circumcision, and so on, and this new teaching? Or is this something completely wipes out all of those requirements, especially for Gentiles, only for Gentiles, for everybody? These are really large and enduring questions that are difficult to answer given the expansive nature of the text in the New Testament. Let us now discuss the end of Jesus' life, which of course is extremely important for later Jewish history. This period is called the Passion, and what you're looking at on the screen here is a very powerful work by Marc Chagall, a European Jewish artist. It's called La Crucifixion Blanche, the White Crucifixion. And as you can see from just a cursory look, that Jesus is so clearly identified as a Jew. Surrounding the crucified Jesus is, on the left, you see apparently a Jew in a San Benito, which is reminiscent of the later Spanish Inquisition, and a Jew holding the Torah scroll who's fleeing for his life with a look of fear on his face. You see exact Torah scrolls being desecrated and set to the flames, and women crying. Of course, this painting was created in 1938, a very momentous time on the eve of World War II. You see Jews as refugees, and those who are desperate, perhaps evocative of the pogroms of 1919. You see that's the Red Army there with the flags coming over. I'll take myself out for a second. There's a scene here with a synagogue on fire and apparently reaching in to take the Torah. It looks like he has an armband. I'm not exactly sure. Is this meant to be evocative of a Nazi, perhaps, to destroy the Torah? I don't know. But above Jesus' head, while fly these angelic beings, and they're clearly distressed. Who do they represent? Jesus' ancestors, perhaps, his descendants, but clearly they're described the way in which not only Jesus is crucified, but all the suffering that has followed in its wake. My teacher in this period was a great scholar named Alan Davies at the University of Toronto, and he speak about the Passion he would emphasize how in basic Christian theology, this is really ground zero level, is that Jesus was not killed by the Jews. The Jews were not to blame for the death of Jesus, because that goes exactly the opposite direction of how the theology should evolve. The whole point is that Christ died for our sins, that's how it's placed in Corinthians and many other places, that Jesus died to save the entire world, right? The suffering servant, the paschal lamb, for God so loved the world. This is the message. To displace the blame for the death onto another people is exactly the opposite of what this passage means. Now, I am hardly a Christian theologian, but it seems to me that this sounds reasonable. We really see it, put in Catholic law, or Nostra Aetate, which in the 1960s reevaluated 20 years after the Holocaust. What have we been saying about the Jews that is not misunderstood? For millennia, Jews have been put with a charge of deicide. That is the idea that Jews killed Jesus, the killing of God, literally. And this is an extremely difficult aspect, really at the heart of Western anti-Semitism, and we will circle back to it in other contexts later. But let us focus, as we are now in this video, on the actual biography of Jesus. Let's try to understand how he was put to death and why. No question, scholars agree that the trial as presented in the Gospels is ahistorical. It could not make sense by Jewish. It could not have happened as described. With blasphemy, well, Islam does not in any way conform to how a Jewish court would work, how the Sanhedrin would work, even if they could mete out death penalties of this period. And it just doesn't make sense. Was he tried for, political insurrection of some kind? Possible, but on the other hand, if that were the case, why wouldn't his followers also be killed? It's hard to reconstruct what actually happened from the accounts that we have in the Gospels. We can say, however, that the text really emphasizes the way in which the Romans wanted to mock Jesus as a Jewish leader. As you can see here from this close-up in the Chagall painting, the Gospels describe how the letters INRI were posted above his cross, which stand for Jesus Nazareth Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And Chagall wanted to underline this messianic aspect to it by writing Yeshu HaNotzri Malka B'Yudai, the Jesus, the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. I don't know if my opinion on this is worth very much. I'm not a specialist in this area, but it seems to me that there may have been some elements in the Jewish community who regarded Jesus as a rabble-rouser who was upsetting the status quo in an unhelpful way. He also clearly had a certain critical mass of followers that would later go on to build this world church that had such tremendous impact. But I get the feeling that this was primarily an act of Roman priests, that he crossed the Russian at the wrong time, and life was cheap. There were thousands of crucifixions of Jews actually in this area. Jesus should stand out as receiving due process when so many other nameless victims did not. It stretches credulity. It's also important to note, by the way, that much of the description of the passion that we receive from later sources offers considerable more detail, often with a much more negative connotation towards Jewish participation. And this is certainly correlated with the increasing gentilization of the church, meaning as the church becomes less and less of a Jewish family affair, as a Jewish mishpacha, so to speak, and becomes much more of a global movement that attracts Romans and Greeks and Scythians and whatever, that then it becomes much more of an us versus them kind of phenomenon. It's much easier to blame the them. Let me leave the passion, however, by discussing one last thing, which is especially noxious and difficult for Jewish history, and that is the so-called blood cry. It's a passage that's recorded in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 25, in which, and again, this is very ahistorical, but Pontius Pilate, the procurator says to the gathered Jews, I'm going to let you have one of my people slain to death go free. Would you like to have Jesus go free or Barabbas, who is a common thief? As the gospel describes, the people say, release Barabbas, and Pontius Pilate says that that will kill Jesus, and the Jews, which has been in the so-called blood cry, is his blood on us and on our children, meaning we Jews take responsibility, and so do future generations. Now, many scholars have argued that given when the Gospel according to Matthew was composed, probably after the destruction, or perhaps in the context of the revolt, this is a reflection on the very next generation of Jews, prefigurement of what would happen a generation after Jesus was killed. Unfortunately, over the centuries, this has been taken as a justification by some for anti-Semitic, arguing that all Jews for all time have somehow accepted responsibility for Jesus' death. As I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, exactly opposite, 180 degrees to a basic understanding of Christian theology, that Jesus died for all our sins, meaning Christians included, not blaming the Jews exclusively. But this takes me further away from history than I am comfortable, and let's conclude at this point. The next video is going to look at how the church evolved, and specifically how you have an increasing separation between the Jewish community in Israel, who walled themselves off from this new idea of Christianity, and how the new evolving Christian church changes from being an internal Jewish phenomenon to a much larger global phenomenon. Thank you very much for watching. My favorite thing right now is Donnell's fresh elbows are leaving a little pile of moisture. That previous video is a very hard one to deliver because I'm not interested in offending anyone, and I'm not interested in specifically promoting a particular point of view in history other than what seems to make sense to me. And but it's hard to avoid it when you look at topics such as the historical Jesus. But we get on a little bit more comfortable ground when we move away from the founder of Christianity and look at still some people who are revered by Christians world around, to understand how the church and synagogue grow so far apart. So let's begin that discussion. Undoubtedly, to understand the direction that Christianity took after Jesus' death is we have to look at the work of Saul of Tarsus, also known as Saint Paul. Now, Paul never actually met Jesus in conventional real life. He encountered the risen Jesus, as he describes, on the road to Damascus. Here's an amazing depiction of this from the 16th century. Here, check this out. This is the risen Jesus here. A very dramatic kind of posture with the angelic host. And in the story that Paul describes, once he sees the risen Jesus, he's struck blind for several days and incapacitated, and it's like an overwhelming experience for him. He eventually comes to his senses and he realizes that he's got to go on a mission to talk about Jesus' teachings, and he was wildly restless. Before we read this thing, just look at how the horse at the center of the composition is such a powerful emotion on the horse's face. I mean, that's really something that I admire. I'm not an art historian, but I love these kinds of things. At any rate, back to Paul. He goes on this massive journey, devoting his life to touring the Eastern Mediterranean. He goes through Asia Minor and the Greek Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula, and his word reaches, perhaps through extensions, even to the Iberian Peninsula. And everywhere he goes, he's speaking primarily to Jewish audiences in the diaspora, to fellow travelers with those whenever possible, and reaching out beyond the Jewish community to talk about what Jesus said and what it means for society. Now, it is at this point that we should understand that Christianity had a tremendous amount to offer the peoples of the world. It took some of the key ideas of Judaism, such as life after death, as a big plus, a personal deity that actually listens to prayer, that is full of mercy, has requirements of humanity, that holds him to task, that they're a mission for humanity. All kinds of really amazing things. And of course, attaching it to a religion of great antiquity. And at the same time, Christianity omitted a lot of the sort of high barriers to admission to Judaism. Judaism at this point is still very much an ethnicity of people. One may convert to Judaism, famous conversion story in the Bible, for example, the story of Ruth, but it's still primarily an ethnos, and one gets into it by being descended from other Jews. And in order to make into the Jewish community, one would have to submit, if one were a male, to circumcision, and then of course there's all the ritual commandments, maintaining the dietary laws, observing the Sabbath, and so on. These things are quite onerous, especially if you don't appreciate how amazingly beneficial they are. So there are a lot of Gentiles who are attracted to these ideas, maybe attracted to Judaism itself, but not necessarily willing to undertake those kind of responsibilities. And Paul finds there's a huge audience who are really listening to it. At the same time, one of the most obvious questions he's going to be asked is, like, so it's different between you and other Jews. I have to explain the relationship between this new emerging ideology and the mother ideology of Judaism. This is where you begin to see something that's called the Adversus Judaeos literary tradition. It's exemplified in particular by John Chrysostom, but we see many other figures among the church fathers who are participating in it, which is kind of like against the Jews. There's a discussion of why Christianity is better that involves why Judaism is worse. Why Judaism is a less so kind of ideology. This obviously has, negative connotations and will have negative repercussions, particularly as the debate becomes much more Gentile versus Jew, us versus them, and this will proceed apace over the next few centuries. Where we see this especially clearly is in the Ecclesia et Synagoga theme, the church and synagogue theme, which, to jump ahead for a few centuries to illustrate this point, you see it in Gothic art in particular. Here's some monumental architecture from Rothschild, which shows on the left the Ecclesia, which represents the church. And you can see she's got an upright staff signifying her authority. Her dogus is done up properly. She's wearing a crown. She's regal. She's clear-eyed. And on the right is a fallen synagogue, which you can see that she's holding the Ten Commandments in her left hand, her weaker hand, and upside down, falling out of her hand. She's not even attached to the law properly. The staff or spear that represents her authority is broken. She's blindfolded, and she's even in an act of decline. She's like falling in an image of contrasting the church to the synagogue. The synagogue is the lesser, is something that we see over and over again as the church fathers develop this Adversus Judaeos kind of literary tradition. Here's another example. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of them. This is from the Church of Notre Dame. You can see that the synagogue has all the same kind of elements, but her eyes are blinded by a serpent, right? Clearly an allusion to the serpent of Genesis and so on, that is not permitting her to see the truth of Christianity. And here's one especially notorious one from the 14th century, a stained glass window in Werben, in Germany, that on the left you can see the church being crowned by heaven, holding the upright staff, the chalice, and so on, riding a tetramorph, a being of mystical significance. And on the right, the synagogue, broken staff, crown knocked off the head, blindfolded. And just to make sure you got the point, a sword is driving through the top of her skull, indicating divine displeasure. One other detail, by the way, before we do this, I find it fascinating that Jesus in this particular image is clearly represented with dark skin, which seems to be something that really energizes a certain portion of my audience. Here you go, fascinating representation. So, back to our topic, however, is clearly a period of time that begins with Paul and extends on later, where the synagogue is divided, the synagogue is put down, the church is clearly ascendant. Some would say that Paul advanced a kind of a theory. There are passages in his writings that suggest that might not be totally, this is the general trend that will be evinced over the next few hundred years. Now, the Jewish community is not standing still while it always happens. There is a reaction from the Jewish world as well. One might even suggest we don't know which is the action and which is the reaction. Perhaps they happen around the same time. But this particular text, the so-called blessing of the heretics, appears probably around the end of the first century. It's described in the Talmud tractate Brachot, page 28, in which a person named Shmuel HaKatan, Samuel the Lesser, is given the task of creating a passage in the liturgy, the mandatory central part of the liturgy called the Amidah, or the 18 blessings, that is designed somehow to make a clear distinction between Jewish Jews and Jewish Christians. In other words, you have this kind of amorphous period of time in the decades following Jesus' death, in which it's not clear what a Jew should believe and what a Christian may practice. And so they asked Samuel to create this blessing, which is inserted into the mandatory prayers. And it's not actually a blessing, it's really a curse. Now, there's a significant amount of debate about exactly how this was created, how it was placed in the liturgy, how it was enforced. But if we look at the text itself, it says in English, "Let there be no hope for informers." Now, that informer is a euphemistic term here for a Jewish Christian delusion, which totally understood by talk. "And may all wickedness instantly perish. May all the enemies of your people be swiftly cut off," etc., etc. And the idea is that, as much of the historiography argues, that if a person was suspected of being a Jewish Christian, meaning a Jew with Christian beliefs, they would be asked to recite the prayers publicly as part of the prayer service. And when they came to this new passage, it was kind of like a litmus test. If they read it, then they would be pronouncing a curse on themselves if they harbored Christian beliefs. On the other hand, if they omitted it, they would be outing themselves as a Christian, and theoretically could be removed not only from the pulpit, but from the synagogue. There's some analysis that suggests that the Gospel according to John was written by someone who experienced this. And in fact, his Gospel is much more filled with invective than the Synoptic Gospels, in references to the synagogue of Satan and things like that. So this was kind of like a line in the sand that, from the Jewish perspective, marked off an ideological boundary that was not present before the inclusion of this text in the prayer. So we see that this is a family dispute. It has gone really sour, and they're separating from both sides. Finally, let us not forget the fact that by the time we get to the early 4th century, Christianity has become so large and so popular that ultimately becomes the state religion under Constantine, shown here. The famous story behind it, there's some interesting things about his family that were attracted to Christianity as well, but he would have this dream where he would see, or this vision where he would see this cross, and it would say, "In hoc signo vinces," under this sign will you conquer, and when he pieced it together that it was attached to Christianity, that's when he converted. That's the traditional story associated with it. But with his conversion and his, stamp of approval on Christianity, a once heavily persecuted faith, not only reading Gospels by people like the Pharisee, who was bent on persecuting, but clearly by the Romans, sent Christians through the gladiatorial games. This represents a dramatic turning point, where the once despised religion is now a state religion with far more power, and that's actually going to be the status quo in Europe until the modern era. Okay, I hope you found this useful. We're going to the next videos back to Judea and focusing on internal Jewish politics, and we look specifically at the origins of the Great Revolt. Thank you very much for watching. Interesting set tonight. Let's just talk about I know, but it's all right. You can pick yourself up. You know, who knows? It's 2025. Maybe the streets will forgive you. Maybe they'll go, wow, don't know. Took a chance out there. A progressive. Let us now direct our attention to a major turning point in Jewish history, and that is the first Roman-Jewish war that occurred in the 60s and the early 70s of the first century. The spark that lit the explosion was something that happened in Caesarea, also pronounced Caesarea or Caesarea, which is a very important center on the coastline. We spoke about this city in the context of Herod the Great. It was a major Roman center during this period. Here you can see a map where it's located halfway roughly to Haifa today's map. There are many factors that come together to create this war, but perhaps one of the most significant general elements of the mood of the era was this dichotomy between the concept of the election of Israel and the disdain and neglect of a corrupt and bureaucratic Rome. On the one hand, there's no question that this first century was filled with messianic thought. We spoke quite a bit about it in the context of the movement of Christianity. Also, we spoke about it in the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of people who are anticipating the arrival of the Messiah, which in Jewish thought is something that would happen with a great political upheaval, with a this-world ruler who would initiate a period of freedom for the Jews in Israel, and then all kinds of other amazing things would happen. This is happening at the same time that Rome has let go of the reins of what's going on in Israel specifically. There's a lot of anarchy and banditry. There's a lot of lawlessness in the streets. They're not patrolling properly. They're not really caring what's going on because the Romans are engaged very heavily in their own self-serving grip, taking bribes and all kinds of things like that. There's also, as we will recall, Israel is never an area that is completely free of non-Jews. There are mixed populations in Israel, and not everyone there feels comfortable with the Jewish vision of what that land should be. It sounds familiar, right? This is basically the older story of that part of the world. And there are provocations that primarily come from the non-Jewish minorities in Yamnia and also later in Caesarea, as we shall see. In Yamnia, also known as Yavna, the local population specifically agitated to provoke Caligula into his disastrous decision to set up an idol to himself in the temple. It turned out as that was short-lived because Caligula was assassinated, but nevertheless there was a lot of friction between Jewish and Jewish populations in Israel. During this time, the combination of those two mood factors tended to push the Pharisees more in the direction of the Zealots, and there was a qualified sympathy for their desire to throw off the yoke of Rome. It was not a full-throated endorsement, but there was nevertheless more of a sense that the Zealots were towards the right side of history, and that was, as best we can tell, the mood of the mood of the Pharisees in the late 50s, and the people followed the Pharisees. The spark that occurred in Caesarea was mundane. It had to do with the property dispute. It seems that the Jews were renting a local space from a non-Jew for a synagogue, and they wanted to actually this space. The non-Jew did not want to sell them. In fact, he wanted to evict them. The Jews must have had some kind of lease arrangement because they went and they petitioned the local procurator, Gestius Florus, who was known for his insensitivity to Jewish causes, who took their money with an agreement to hear their case and then promptly ignored it. So what ended up happening is on one particular Shabbat in the year 66, some local miscreant, it's not clear from Josephus whether it's the same person as the owner of the building or perhaps someone who's involved in this group, this individual went and performed a ritual idolatrous sacrifice of birds words right at the end of the synagogue over an earthenware container in such a way, apparently he was aware of some of the laws of defilement, some of the complicated laws involving earthenware containers of defilement that are more complex than we can get into right here. But at any rate, it really enraged the local Jewish population of Caesarea. Some of the more hot-headed elements of the community actually rose up and began to riot, but they rapidly found that the mood of the local population in Caesarea, which was, again, recall, primarily a Roman-oriented city, not one of the more Jewish cities, what the tide of the rioting turned against them. What ended up happening is Gessius Florus turned a blind eye to this. He arrested the Jewish petitioners who had asked to buy the synagogue in the first place, and the rest of the Jewish community actually fled with their Torah scrolls to nearby Nabata. The news of the events in Caesarea soon reached Jerusalem, a much larger Jewish population, much more religiously inclined population, and there was an uproar, as you can imagine. Gessius Florus, the procurator, sent troops to Jerusalem in order to try and quell the unrest, and while he was there, he actually seized a relatively small amount of money from the temple treasury, which certainly was a more incendiary action and was not going to calm down the population there. In fact, the local population even publicly walked around holding their hats out, begging for money on behalf of Gessius Florus to mock him. That certainly didn't improve relations between the procurator and the local Jewish population. But the violence got actually quite serious, especially in the upper city, and some people were killed. There was bloodshed, and the Antonia fortress, which we'll see a little bit later, to the north of the Temple Mount, was actually isolated with the Roman troops imprisoned within. King Agrippa II, the Jewish king, who was actually not the king of Judea proper, he was really king of a region to the north. We spoke about him a little while ago. He attempted to calm things down and failed, and as a result, he fled to the north and avoided the bloodshed at this point. He would later actually end up participating in the war on the side of the Romans, but that's a little bit later. Menachem, the son of Judas, the Galilean, arrives. He was one of several zealot leaders who would compete for authority. And in this context of the Elazar ben Hanan suspended the sacrifice in honor of the emperor. That essentially meant that revolt was open. Up until this point, the Jews had always maintained a regular sacrifice in honor of the emperor. This goes all the way back to Cyrus, at least. And the idea of stopping this was extremely insulting to Rome, and this meant that it was open revolt. Now, there's some fascinating discussions of all these events in the Talmud as well, which add significant color to all of them. But for the time being, present the Josephine account, and perhaps in another context, we can come back to the details of the Talmud offers as well. At this point, the local forces that the procurator was able to muster, a fairly small number of troops, could not handle the riot anymore. And so Cestius Gallus, who was the governor of Syria, and the region of Israel was within his supervisory map, he arrived with the Fulminata Legion, the 12th Legion. We're talking now about 20,000 soldiers. So he comes down from the north and he makes his way throughout the region until he gets to Jerusalem. Now we should remember that these legionnaires are professional trained soldiers. We're talking about maximum 23,000 rebels spread out throughout the entire region without discipline, without arms, training. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain and they had the advantage of local contacts, but they were at a serious disadvantage when fighting actual troops. Nevertheless, they were so enraged that when Cestius Gallus entered Jerusalem, and he actually came into he saw what kind of opposition he was facing, and he was intimidated by the Jewish rebels. He decided to retreat, and on his way back, he met disaster. Specifically at a pass called Beit Horon. The Beit Horon pass is a very narrow strip that requires essentially, a couple of soldiers walking side by side as they make their way down this long pass. And the rebels were able to ambush them, and they actually wrought terrible havoc on Cestius Gallus's legion. They actually captured the eagle standard of the 12th Legion, which was is a tremendous insult. It's kind of like capturing the flag, huge symbolic value. And they also, less symbolic value, but really they actually captured the Roman siege equipment, which would be very useful for them in the next couple of years of the war. Cestius Gallus actually survived the encounter at Beit Horon, but he was forced to limp back in a humiliating defeat, and this meant that Rome had to significantly accelerate their efforts. Next, we'll explore the second phase of the war, when Rome decides to send a much more battle-hardened general, Vespasian, along with considerably more troops to prosecute the war. Thank you very much for watching. Just remember, I'm just looking for other black people, because I don't go nowhere if there's not other black people there. Okay, well, have fun in Tokyo. How the fuck you get on this show? It's like 12 black people in this whole audience, and I'm 4 of them. The Roman-Jewish War essentially ended with the destruction of the temple, which demonstrated the futility of the immediate messianic hopes of the Jews in the region. However, fighting continued for a few more years, either to the year 73 or possibly 74 of the Common Era. There are a few holdout fortresses of Jews outside of Jerusalem, and the most significant of those was undoubtedly Masada, which is shown here. It's a dramatic cliff-top fortress. It was actually the palace of Herod at one vacation palace, and it's in a very football Judean desert, and is essentially impregnable. The only way to attack Masada is to climb its faces, which are quite steep, at least on 2 sides of it, and very, very difficult to actually its defenses. The rebels under Elazar ben Yair actually laid in a ton of supplies, so they could actually last there for many years. Nevertheless, the Romans were brilliant and dogged engineers. They ended up climbing the mountain, and they built a siege tower that was about 80 meters or 260 feet high to be able to breach the final wall. When they got to the very last barrier, which was made of wood, and they set it on fire, the rebels located within the compound realized that there was no way they could keep the Roman soldiers out, and so in a very dramatic act, almost 1,000 rebels, and we're talking here about families, not just soldiers, but men, women, and children, committed mass suicide overnight rather than have themselves be turned over as slaves to the Romans. A very dramatic moment in Jewish history, a complex moment that has reverberations in modern Israeli ideology as well. And hopefully we'll come back to that when we get towards the end of the series. The Romans enacted significant punishment on the remaining population, and we will go into some greater detail as we talk about the diaspora and moving forward. But for now, let's take a few examples of it. Symbolically, we see the institution of the Judea coin. The Romans actually printed quite a few examples of this coin. On the left, they usually have a portrait of Vespasian. You see him wearing the laurel wreath victory around his head. And on the right, there is a Roman soldier standing by a balsam pine, which is one of the most important exports of Israel at the time. And there is a forlorn woman with her head in her hand. And she is representing Judean people. So Judea Capta means Judea is taken captive. And this was a form of propaganda. You know, coins are like messages that circulate everywhere and people see them and it means something. It was a very important way of advertising state power. Just to show you a couple of examples of this Judea coin, sometimes the Roman soldier is portrayed as being way out of proportion, large compared to the woman to show the dominance of Rome. And in some especially chilling cases, she's actually shown with her hands bound behind her back as a slave to be taken away into captivity. The Romans also celebrated this in Rome proper with the erection of the Arch of Titus. You see it here. And inside the arch, when we zoom in a little bit, there is a depiction of the Romans taking away spoils from the temple. Here's a better resolution look at it. You can see that they're clearly holding the candelabra called the menorah, which would have stood in the Temple Mount area. A scholar at Yeshiva University did some chemical analysis of the sculpture and actually was able to reconstruct how it would have looked to the Romans in the ancient period, but they preferred their sculptures to be painted, so it would have looked like bricks to Romans. You see on the left, there's a sign that says Leges Judeo, or the law of the Jews. Perhaps that was referring to the tablets of the law, or maybe a Torah scroll. You can see they're clearly carrying the menorah. The sign next to it says Candelabrum Judeorum, the Jewish candelabrum. And on the right, they have the Sadeorum, the holy thing of the Jews, which appears in the shulchan with the altar with the badim, the staves that would be used to carry it, perhaps. The Romans also to actually meet with Vespasian directly. This is one of the details that the Talmud offers. And he makes a request of Vespasian, actually three requests. But the one that's especially significant for us is he says to Vespasian, in Hebrew we have the phrase, Tenri Yavne v'chachamecha. Give me the city of Yavne, Yamnia in Greek, and its sages. Which meant that he wanted to have a safe base where the pacifistic Pharisees could retreat and could continue to engage in religious study. This ultimately was the seed from which future Jewish leadership would grow, and the future of the Jewish people would be preserved through these scholars studying the traditional values and techniques. We continue this in future lectures. Thank you very much for that.
And a great return for Michael Hines, everybody. We are flying through it now. We are cooking. I gotta say, normally I don't do this during an episode, but I gotta tell you guys, this is one of my favorite episodes of the year so far. How about Amber Downhill and Rothschild? I had a feeling that this chemistry would be crazy and wild.
If we move forward about 45 years from the destruction of the temple and the fall of Masada, we get to another period of violence called the Kitos Rebellion. Now, it's a very kind of rebellion. We have scattered data points from different sources that all reveal something about this rebellion, but we're not really sure about much of the most essential questions. But we should say one thing to begin with. Many scholars argue whether or not this is really the second Roman-Jewish war or something different. It's basically a primarily diaspora phenomenon. It's something that you see primarily outside of Israel, in other words. It's not so much in Judea itself. But let's try and understand at least some things about this Kitos Rebellion. The Kitos Rebellion occurs at the very end of the rule of the Emperor Trajan. The 5 decades since the destruction of the temple have been absolutely terrible for the Jews. There is a tremendous amount of post-destruction trauma that is definitely spiritual in nature. I mean, the Jews had invested all of their spiritual understanding of how they related to the infinite through the temple. And even when the temple was corrupted by a priesthood that was essentially something that could be bought from the Romans, there was still this idea that somehow the temple was the hinge upon which the entire universe turned. And now with that temple gone, what exactly would Judaism do? What would Judaism look like? It was a period of phenomenal demographic upheaval. You have literally tens of thousands of Jews taken off in slavery to Rome. You have refugees who are scattered throughout the entire region on the eastern Mediterranean, the Iberian and Greek peninsulas, around the Black Sea littoral, and further east to Mesopotamia. And you don't have the same kind of center in Israel as you had before. would the Jewish people even survive this tremendous trauma? The Romans, for their part, did many things to make things worse for the Jews. They certainly want to stamp out any possibility of a future revolt, and so there were all kinds of measures put in place to try and demean the Jews both spiritually, psychologically, demographically, and financially. The Fiscus Judaicus was instituted, and this was a replacement of the mandatory Machatzis shekel, the half shekel tax that Jews had from biblical times paid all over the world toward the upkeep of the Temple of Jerusalem. The Fiscus Judaicus tax took that money and made it mandatory, but instead of devoting it to the upkeep of the Temple in Jerusalem, it was directed to Rome and to the upkeep of the Temple for Jupiter. I mean, really offensive kind of thing for the Jews. And at the same time, the messianic ferment that we saw with the birth of Christianity was still continuing. In fact, it would take another couple of decades before it would have its final defeat, at least in the second century, under Bar Kokhba. Now, Trajan himself, towards the end of his rule, became involved in a very heavy war with the Parthian Empire, which was the Persian Empire that controlled Babylonia. The Parthian Empire would ultimately fall, and in their successor empire, the Sasanians, that's when the main elements of the Talmud would be put together. But at any rate, Trajan waged war against the Parthians, and he actually penetrated all the way to the very bottom of Mesopotamia. That is, this region here that you can see is sort of like a yellowish color going right down to the Persian Gulf. This was briefly controlled by Roman troops. Now, what's interesting for our purposes, and connecting it to the Kitos Rebellion, is that the Jews in Mesopotamia apparently sided with the Parthians against the Roman invaders, which is perhaps not surprising. Jews had been living in Babylonia since the 6th century before the Common Era. I mean, they've been there for 800 years. They certainly have roots sunk deep into that territory. And when the Romans came in invading, they took up arms to defend their homeland alongside the Parthians. This obviously was not taken very lightly by the Romans, and Lucius Quietus, who was a commander in charge of the region, was put in charge of also devastating the Jewish population and quashing any resistance to Roman rule. So this is one element of the Kitos Rebellion, is Lucius Quietus' early participation. There will be another chapter with his story as well, and maybe I should give it away. The word Kitos in the Kitos Rebellion is probably from his surname, Lucius Quietus. That's probably how we get Kitos. So it's named essentially after him. Perhaps because of his notorious activity putting down the Jewish rebels in Mesopotamia, or I shouldn't say the rebels, the Jewish defenders of Mesopotamia, but it could also have to do with his later activities in Judea. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a diaspora affair. It was certainly not limited to Mesopotamia with the advance into Parthian Empire territory in the year 114. You need to see that also developed on the coast of North Africa in particular. Let's have a look at this map here, where you can see the extent of the Roman Empire at the time of his death in 117. First of all, we have the activity in Mesopotamia, which is related to the invasion of the Parthian Empire. But then we have some interesting things happening in what would be today Libya. The Kitos Rebellion had major activity in this town. The pronunciation, I know some people are really sticklers for pronunciation. I've looked it up and I've heard it pronounced as Cyrene in English. In Greek, it would have been something like Kurene. So I'm probably going to say Kurene, and I would be wrong, but anyway, this is another look at rebel activity during this period. And then we also have significant activity throughout Egypt, and then finally in Cyprus. And once all of this diaspora activity is discussed, we're going to look very briefly at Judea, where, of course, there was the polygamous Kitos, the Kitos Rebellion itself, as described in the Talmud. Let's look at Kurene first. The various sources that refer to this assert that there may have been some kind of messianic issue to this, because there was an individual who was referred to as Lukuas in one source and Andreas in a different source. It is possible that this is the same person. It was not at all uncommon in the ancient period, especially in Greek and Roman areas, for Jews to have two names, a Hebrew name and a Greek name, or a local name. I myself have two names, right? I have a Hebrew name that my friends know me by, and I have Henry, which I publish under, and stuff like that. So anyways, but he referred to himself in one of these sources as a king. So that implies some kind of unusual political, although some of the church historians suggest it was sort of a false messianic way. And under this Lukua/Andreas, there was a report of Jewish attacks on Roman temples and public buildings in particular. It's an interesting aspect of this revolt is that it seems to be one that is definitely attacking Rome. Again, remember, it's just a few decades since the destruction of the temple, and there are a lot of Jews who are very angry. And let us not forget that there are a lot of Jews who were originally rebels in the First War who have fled to various cities in the diaspora, and they could be ending this uprising again in about the year 115. Now, one of our most important historians that tells us a little bit about the People's Rebellion is Cassius Dio. He is a Roman historian who was active at the end of the second and the first half of the 3rd century. And he's great for a lot of things, but there's certain areas where you just don't know how seriously to take. So, for example, when he describes this rebellion in Kyrene, he puts it like this, and just listen to this language. Meanwhile, the Jews in the region of Kyrene had put a certain Andreas at their head and were destroying both the Romans and the Greeks. They would, here we go. They would eat the flesh of their victims, make belts for themselves of their entrails, anoint themselves with their blood, and wear their skins for clothing. But that's not all things. Many they sawed in two from the head downwards. Others they gave to wild beasts, still others they forced to fight with gladiators. I mean, it's hard to take this seriously. It's just so bizarre and so un-Jewish. Certainly Jews have gone to war, and it's not impossible to imagine atrocities happening when Jews, like many people, go to war, but these are over the top. And in fact, when you look at Cassius Dios's other treatments of barbarian attacks on Rome, they also appear quite, portrayed. I wanted to read for you the passage where he describes how the Britons deal with from the Romans. And my gosh, I can't even do that because it's actually graphic in its nature. So just trust me, Cassius Dio is liable to exaggerate for dramatic effect. Egypt also saw widespread rebellions between years 115 and 117, widespread Jewish rebellions. Where apparently the Jews were taking advantage of the absence of Roman forces who had gone off to fight against the Parthian Empire in Mesopotamia. And once again, it's similar kinds of targets. Temples, shrines, for example, the shrine of Nemesis at Memphis, public works, roadways, things like that. It seems like the Jews rebelling are really directing their attacks specifically at the Roman Empire. It seems to have a very political motive. The economic motive does not seem to rise to the surface, and other than those messianic references, it seems to be something that is really an attempted uprising. It is fascinating to think, though, like, why are the Jews all over the diaspora? Do they really think they're going to slow Rome off? But they obviously are somewhat coordinated in doing this. There was, of course, a harsh military response from Trajan, who came back with heavy forces and many killed. This is the period when the great synagogue of Alexandria, which the Talmud says was so large that in order to know when to answer Amen to a person reading the prayers, they had to wave big flags. You could see the flags and know that it was up to that part. But this is the period when the great synagogue of Egypt, of Alexandria, Egypt, was destroyed. Jewish property was seized, and basically at this point, by the time we get to the end of the Parthian War, the Jewish community in North Africa goes into a steep decline, and it will not rise again for several centuries. We can say the same thing about the island of Cyprus. As we saw earlier in Cassius' discussion, a Jew may set foot on that island, that is Cyprus. But even if one of them is driven upon its shores, Jews were banned from the island after a rebellion there. And in fact, this statement is supported because there's no other evidence of Jews ever ending on this island until the 4th century. So hundreds of years of Jews gone from the region. What happened in Judea proper? This is where the Talmud refers to Homos Kitos, the fifth rebellion. You know that Lucius Quietus, you remember him from Mesopotamia, right? He was the person who put down the Jewish rebellion. He is sent back by Trajan and appointed as governor in Judea. We don't know a lot about how he conducted himself in that area, but we know that there was, at least the Talmud refers to some acts of violence, and we know that Lucius Quietus brought in a second Roman legion to support his activities there. I wish we knew more about this particular rebellion. It is fascinating to see that it takes place across the diaspora. It represents something we haven't talked about in any detail yet, but we will be coming back to it in a few lectures. But we have to move on to a much more powerful and significant rebellion that had a deep mark, big scars on the Jewish psyche, and that is the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Thank you very much for watching.
James, you had a fucking fantastic set. You rolled with the punches every step of the way. You are truly an 11-year comedy veteran, and you have the jokes for it. You have the stage presence for it. Here's a big joke. Look, sign up. We want to see more of you. Come back, James Harrigan. Wow. The first.
The Bar Kokhba revolt, so named after its leader, Shimon Bar Kokhba, is often referred to as the Second Roman Jewish War, the first being the Great Revolt of 66 through 73 or 74 that resulted in the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. And then there's possibly another conflict, the so-called Kitos Rebellion that we discussed in the last video. Some people consider that the Second Roman Jewish War, and this would make Bar Kokhba the third Roman Jewish War. But unlike the Kitos, this is something that happened within the boundaries of Judea, and certainly constitutes a full-fledged revolt against Rome that required tremendous energy for the Romans to rebel. So much is unknown about the Bar Kokhba revolt. We do not have really extensive sources describing it. I'll go into a little bit more detail. Even to the point where it was not until the 1960s that we were certain what Bar Kokhba's name actually was. It appears that his name, based on some Greek language documents that were discovered in the Dead Sea region, Greek having the advantage of being a phonetic language with all of the vowels written out, which is something that is not true of Hebrew. We referred to him as Bar Kosiba, or Ben Kosiba. That was his proper name. The Bar means son of, and Kosiba is the surname. He was known as Bar Kokhba to his followers. A slight pun on the name. Kokhba means the son of a bar that has kind of like messianic overtones to it. But to his detractors, he is known as Bar Koziba, with a Z instead of S. The word kazab in Hebrew meaning deception or lies. But his actual name was Kosiba, and he's known popularly in the way that Rabbi Akiva, one of his most important followers, called him Bar Kokhba, the star. It's hard to underestimate the importance of Bar Kokhba in the Israeli civic mentality, because Bar Kokhba represents the last living president of the Jewish polity until the 20th century. In a moment, I'd like to talk to you about Dr. Yigael Yadid, who wrote a very work on Bar Kokhba, arrives the moment when the current president in 1960 saw an inscription that was written by the previous president of Israel some 1900 years earlier. It's really important to see this as a sort of a culmination of that strive for statehood that had a 1900-year hiatus. Well, we can see this graphically is in the Knesset menorah the sculpture that stands outside the contemporary building known as the Knesset, which is where Israel's parliament sits. And in this candelabra, you can see that there are many historical figures that are represented on the arms of the candelabra. Zooming into the center, you see that the three central uppermost branches have representations of three distinct leaders in Jewish history. The first is Moses, who is shown here from a biblical passage that describes the attack of the Amalekites against the Jews on their way from Egypt to Israel. And as the passage there describes, as long as Moses had his hands up in the air heavenward, then the Jews would succeed in battle. And when he lowered his hands, they would fail. So he was supported by his two lieutenants, holding his hands in the air so he could retain that position for the duration of the battle, representing a military victory with an appeal to God at its very center. On the left, you see David. We should understand that the left here is on Moses' right, the higher level of authority and status. David shown here as a young man holding up the severed head of Goliath, a very important passage that describes, again, a military victory with supernatural assistance from God. And then finally, going to the less significant of the two, but still right at the very center of the candelabra, presentation of Bar Kokhba. And like David, and he is represented here, an attitude of decline and an attitude of defeat rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful. Nevertheless, he is shown here as a powerful military figure and as a tragic one as well. And that's the story we're going to go over in the next 15 minutes or so. Our sources, as I mentioned, are somewhat limited. We have an important Roman historian, Cassius Dio, sometimes called Dio Cassius, who is somewhat problematic because we only have him in an abbreviated form, as we shall see shortly. We have Eusebius, an important church historian, Cassius Dio being active in the basically at the turn of the 3rd century. Eusebius, about 100 years later, one of the church fathers, and then passing references. And then we have some amazing passages in the Talmud and in the but they are not necessarily historical in the same way that some of these other historians are conformed to Western sensibilities. There are also, though, some famous and important discoveries in the 1960s. Primarily archaeological discoveries conducted by this man, Yigael Yadir, who is one of these amazing Israeli figures who has at once both a war hero, very highly placed at the top of the Israeli Defense Forces, and at the same time an archaeologist and a scholar and a very gripping writer. I'm going to produce a little review of his treatment of Bar Kokhba in a separate video. Absolutely fascinating account, very much worth reading. So let's try to understand what we can about Bar Kokhba and his rebellion from the sources that we have. Here's a children's book. The Hebrew translation is The History of Israel for Children. The Bar Kokhba rebellion, you can see a very heroic figure and rallying the troops against one and so on. This rebellion that took place from the years 1 to 135 of the Common Era. The leader, of course, as we said, is Bar Kokhba. In the Midrash, he is described as a mythic figure of phenomenal proportions. Extremely brutal and ferocious warrior, not unlike some of the depictions of David that we have in Tanakh and also in the Talmud. The Talmud says, for example, and this is kind of like, you have to assume it's a kind of a hyperbole that is not uncommon, that to test their bravery, Bar Kokhba would have all of his recruits have a digit sliced off their hand, which is totally forbidden in Jewish law. By kids don't try this at home. But the rabbis complained and said, Bar Kokhba, what are you doing? How long would you mutilate the young men of Israel? well, what else, how else am I going to test their bravery? And they suggested, well, have them uproot a living tree from the ground with their bare hands. Will that do? He says, yes, that will certainly test it. And so that's how they were tested, as the Talmud says, that they were for their strength and their bravery. I don't know how to take this on a literal sense, but when we see his writings based on the archaeological discoveries in the 1960s, we definitely see that he was a very determined and very insistent leader, demanding retribution of his followers if they did not comply with that. He was known to many as a possible Messiah. And let's remember, in Jewish terms, Messiah, Mashiach, is a human being, a political leader who will effect a military unification of the land of Israel, who will bring in all of the exiles, who will bring the gathering of the exiles, initiate a period of peace and prosperity throughout the world. And many saw Bar Kokhba as that life, supported Bar Kokhba as a possible Messiah. He was contradicted by one of his colleagues. One of them who said to him, Akiva, you will have grass growing from your cheekbones before Bar Kokhba is the Messiah. Impossible, and you will be, and Bar Kokhba will never be. The notion of Bar Kokhba Messiah certainly inspired me to follow him. By the way, one of the amazing font top right, it says, Bar Kokhba, Nasi, the Yisrael president of Israel. Unfortunately, there's so much we really don't know about the war. One of the most basic things that we don't know about this war is why exactly did it start. So Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, gives us an account of the war. Unfortunately, the only version of Cassius Dio's account has not survived antiquity in its original formulation, but rather as what they call an epitome. We say in English, the epitome is something, we tend to mean something as exemplary, the best, and the ideal, but in classical terms, it really means an abbreviation, meaning, oh, this is too big, too long to read. Can you just give me, like, the Cliff Notes, the short version of this? That's what an epitome was. And so we have an 11th century epitome by Johannes Kipilinius that's shown here, that gives us, unfortunately, just passing references to Bar Kokhba, and we don't know exactly what Cassius Dio wrote, but we're hopeful that this is correct. Cassius Dio did. The reason for the revolt was that the Emperor Hadrian, shown here, decided to rebuild Jerusalem, but rename it after himself, Aelia Capitolina, right? Because his middle name is Aelius. And to build on the site of the temple to God, instead a temple to the Latin god, the Roman god Jupiter. And this, according to Cassius Dio, it inflamed the population of Jews and a rebellion ensued. Now, according to Hadrian's own biographer, Spartianus, who wrote De Vita Hadriani, the life of Hadrian, the Roman Empire, it had nothing to do with the rebuilding of the temple. It has to do with a ban on genital mutilation, something which the Romans had frequently issued. But it's uncertain what exactly this is talking about. For many, it was understood to refer to castration, which is forbidden in Jewish law as well. But it's possible that the revolt was started because Jews thought it referred to circumcision. And in fact, perhaps it did refer to circumcision, but later that was certainly exempted from the ban on genital mutilation. Others say no. The Midrash, for example, suggests that it had to do with an effort to rebuild the temple that was then thwarted by the Samaritans. Finally, Pausanias, who was a 2nd century Roman geographer, who was followed in some degree by Eusebius and Jerome, who were church fathers who lived in the 10th centuries, who said that it's possible not that the revolt was caused by persecution, i.e. these decrees, but that these decrees followed the revolt, meaning it was the general environment, whether it was the political oppression, the destruction of the Judean state of the previous war, or whether it was the Messianic ferment, but these things might have caused the revolt.
Momentarium Labs, how you living, pal?
Persecutions, which were
What's good,
especially
son?
associated
Yeah, I didn't want
with
to fucking
the
talk with you anyway,
called the
dude.
10 Martyrs of the State, the Asala Ege Malchus, that have formed an important part of the Jewish liturgy, that those occurred not before the rebellion, but rather after the rebellion as a response. Not impossible. At any rate, these are the major theories currently floating regarding the origins of the war. We will have to conduct further research and hopefully find some more archaeological discoveries that will give us some insight. For certain, however, the war was quite brutal, and it lasted for about 3 years. We know of Bar Kokhba's exploits, which appear to have been initially quite successful. Bar Kokhba and his rebels seized Jerusalem, apparently, and marked that event with the minting of many coins. Actually, not precisely the minting. What they did was they would take Roman coins, heat them up, and then re-stamp them, which in itself, by the way, is an act of treason. And they would re-stamp them with Jewish themes, and they would mark them with messages like, the freedom of Jerusalem, year 1, year 2, things like that. Here's one depiction of the Bar Kokhba coins. You can see that the top have the temple on them, on top of a Roman tetradrachm, that's a cella in Hebrew, and at the very top is a little star bead, which is emblematic of Bar Kokhba itself. At the bottom you see traditional themes like a lyre, grapes, an urn, and trumpets. But what's interesting is what you don't see, which are any representations of human beings or animals, which was very much against Jewish sensibilities in the 2nd century. Here's another version that shows at the top, these are palm fronds, or specifically the lulav and esrog, the albuminum, the 4 species that are held together as part of the Sukkot celebration. It's interesting to note that Bar Kokhba, from as far as we can tell, not only the attraction of Rabbi Akiva and the various depictions in the Talmudic sources, but also in the archaeological evidence, seems to have been leading a movement of observant Jews, that they were striving to maintain the observances of the holidays and things like that, even when they were besieged and literally living in caves. We know that the war was quite brutal, that Hadrian suffered from, and as we shall see, had to bring in significant reinforcements to be able to put down this very successful guerrilla rebellion, which took great advantage of the local terrain. Eusebius refers to the Jewish rebels being active in the cave system of the Judean mountain range. We know that Hadrian suffered not only because of the support he had to draw in from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, but also because, as Cassius Dio points out, when he wrote to the Senate the report of what was happening in Judea, he pointedly omitted the phrase "mihi et legionibus bene," which means I and my forces are well, meaning I and the armed forces, the military, are doing fine, thank you. He took out that standard phrase, which for Cassius Dio, writing in the 2nd century, was a very big statement to the Senate. Ultimately, however, the rebels could simply not hold out against the overwhelming might of the Romans, and they were reduced to hiding in a series of caves. Some of them are shown here, largely undiscovered until the 20th century. There were originally some Bedouin who made their way into these caves in the early 20th century, and as artifacts began to slowly filter out into the black market, that's when Gael Yadin and his decided to investigate. In the early 1960s, found several of these caves and found some amazing discoveries that we're going to look at in this lecture and in a couple others as well. For example, these urns, which are quite remarkable in themselves, but one of the things that tells us about Bar Kokhba is that they used to have like decorations here of facial features that were intentionally defaced, as were all of the implements that had decoration nature in the cave. So in other words, these may have been made by Romans or Phoenicians or something like that, but the Bar Kokhba rebels not wanting to transgress the commandment against making images, specifically teach them to remove that. In the sense of their religious orientation, there are several other indicators of this as well, such as, for example, the discovery of balls of unworked yarn that was dyed with what they believed was the tefillah. Tefillah is a blue color, which may be a little bit distorted by age, 2,000 years, right? And photography, 1960s, right? And this would have been used for the single blue thread in the fringed garments worn by religious Jews, the so-called tzitzit. What chemical analysis of this particular dye, however, in these threads, indicates that the Bar Kokhba rebels were apparently holding on to some forged tefillah, which the Talmud says was a problem in the era, because with the technology of the day, it was impossible to know whether this was the actual tefillah made with the specific mollusks that produced this dye, or whether it was made from a vegetable source, which would have rendered it unfit for the tallis, for the prayer shawl, but nevertheless was frequently circulated in the black market. Many more mysteries surrounding this, but nevertheless, you get the idea that the Bar Kokhba rebels cared about Jewish rituals. Now, as the war went, Hadrian, seeing that he was having a difficult time, he summoned none other than Julius Severus from Britain. This is an incredible general who had tremendous success in putting down a difficult riot on the other side of the Roman Empire, so he was specifically brought in order to maintain the order. Hadrian also summoned a 6th legion, an estimated 50,000 troops when all were calculated, and that's an amazing number. It's impossible to imagine that Kokhba had more than perhaps 10 or 15,000 at his disposal, and even that is definitely on the high end of the estimation. Nevertheless, the Roman casualties by a contemporary, Cornelius Fronto, being very similar to what the Romans lost in Britain, so that indicates really pitched battles one after another. Dio does give us a sense of the Jewish casualties. He gives us the very large number, 580,000 casualties over almost 1,000 villages. Now, it's possible that, especially in terms of the casualties, the numbers are hugely inflated. Even with these large numbers, we do know that 6 legions were in the area, so it certainly would have been an absolutely horrific massacre all told. The last was at Beitar, shown here, and as the last of the Bar Kokhba rebels were killed by the Romans, there was this particular event was actually enshrined in the liturgy. The grace after meals includes a blessing which specifically was composed in memory of the martyrs of Beitar. Like the name Bar Kokhba resonates throughout Jewish history. We have, for example, the youth scouting movement led by Vladimir Jabotinsky, shown here in the center of this group of scouts, was a very important youth movement that had a very important role in the founding of the State of Israel, and by extension to it, the Likud party itself, through people like Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel. Thank you very much for watching.
I'm sorry, a misunderstanding. One of the greatest jokes I've ever done in my life. It's all, it's so funny. People didn't even notice. No, that was funny. It's just like, these people don't understand. I missed that time to jokes. We're gonna get some, don't touch me, Rob, I'm being serious. We're gonna get some Adam's apple juice for you over here. I was there for you.
One of the most consequential questions in Jewish history is a very basic one. Who is a Jew? Now, you might think that this is a settled law, that there's really no question about it, but in fact, when you look a little more deeply at Jewish history, you see that there are several periods in history when it becomes a very important question. For the vast majority of Jewish history, in particular the last 2 millennia, most Jews regarded a Jew as someone who has a Jewish mother. That is, it is matrilineal. The nominal identity of a person follows that personal status, regardless of affiliation with a religion or self-identification. But that has not always been the universal case for Jewish history. What I'd like to do today is focus on this question as we introduce the question of women in ancient Israel in general. Now, let us recall that this is certainly a controversial question as of the late 20th and early 21st century. And this is primarily because of a decision that was made by the Reform movement in 1983 that recognized patrilineal descent. More precisely, it's both matrilineal and patrilineal descent. But in other words, this represented an acknowledgement by a major Jewish movement that as long as one parent was ethnically Jewish, however you define that Jewishness, then the child could also be Jewish. There's more to it than that, and perhaps one of the most important things to think about is, did this decision, initiate change, or was it simply a recognition of change that already happened? Because intermarriage, especially in American Jewry, was such a high that we already have phenomenon of children like a Jewish rather than a Jewish mother, and wish to identify with the Jewish community and find that they are shut out because the matrilineal principle, dominant one for the last 2 years. And it's resulted in a lot of really painful moments. For example, in this article by Shana Tikva, written in 2019. It's a very difficult and personal issue. In this particular video, I mainly intend to just go over the historical issues, and I will leave the philosophical and religious and indeed sociological and psychological issues to people who are more expert. So the question that we really have is, when did the matrilineal status become effective, or when did it become the norm? We can see when you read the Bible, it's very clear 2 things. First of all, there is a strong prohibition, very clearly worded, against intermarriage with Canaanites in particular, but one can easily generalize it refers to intermarriage in general. And at the same time, you see in particular some really important figures like Joseph and Moses and Solomon, who all apparently marry non-Jewish women. So how do you square these things? And by the way, of course, Joseph, Moses, and Solomon, their children are recognized as being Jewish. How is this the case? So we're going to go into some of the major issues here, but I want to point out that perhaps the most significant study of this by J.D. Cohen, The Big Jewishness, which goes through a lot of the important issues in the classical period, especially issues of conversion and issues of matrilineal versus patrilineal descent and so on. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions, but there's no question it's a masterful survey of the sources, and there's a lot of value in this particular work. So trying to square this conundrum of, on the one hand, we have this long-standing practice of matrilineal descent, and on the other hand, we have these biblical examples that seem to contradict it. There are 3 logical ways to approach the challenge. The first is to say that, well, let's say the law of matrilineal descent, this concept, the principle, was not always described in the text, meaning that, Moses married a Midianite, but the Midianite woman went through a conversion. And Joseph married, an Egyptian woman, but she went through a conversion. If that is the case, then you have to wonder, well, why doesn't the text tell us this? Why doesn't the Torah reveal that this is in fact what happened? Wouldn't we be prone to be misunderstanding the text if it doesn't say something which actually happened? That's one possibility. Another logical possibility is to say that, yes, the law was always in effect. The Jews always adhered to this matrilineal principle, but it was sometimes ignored. You have that sometimes where, as Rabbi Beryl Wine often likes to say, you should never confuse Judaism with Jews, right? Jews do not necessarily behave in normative, acceptable ways. So perhaps, the examples we have in the Bible are, not in conformity with the way Jews are supposed to behave. Now, that would be obviously an acceptable answer, except the fact that, these figures, Moses, Joseph, Solomon, and others, they're really important people. And are we really going to assert that they were behaving contrary to law, that's definitely problematic. There's also a smaller problem, which we won't go into right now, but the Midrash has a principle that even before the Torah was given, Jews of that level, at any rate, certainly in conformity with Torah itself. Like, for example, the law keeping kosher were not given until the Torah was given, but you still wouldn't have the patriarchs and matriarchs going out for non-kosher food, God forbid, that kind of thing. But that's a smaller problem. Let's just avoid that for now. The third logical possibility is that maybe the law wasn't always maybe the law of matrilineal descent, or the principle of matrilineal descent, was introduced later in history, which would mean that the early biblical figures who followed apparently a patrilineal principle were not contravening the law. Again, there's that small midrashic objection, which is reasonable, but not for us today. But if that is the case, that we say the law was not necessarily in effect, when did it change? So that's the three possibilities. Let's look at them in turn. But let's start from the basic one. Let's say, when's the first unequivocal statement of this principle? So the first one, of course, is the Torah itself. And here's one classic passage. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 7, verse 4. So verse 3 says, do not intermarry with them, meaning the surrounding non-Jewish nations. Do not give your daughters to the sons, or take their daughters for your sons. And then in verse 4 it says, Ki yasir et bincha me'acharai, v'avdu Elohim acherim, v'chara af Hashem bachem, v'hishmitcha maher. Right? Now let's look at the translation. It says, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. And the Lord's anger will blaze forth against you, and he will promptly wipe you out. Right? Really strong word of criticism, I think. The problem with this particular passage, and normally Sepharia is Amen, but they're relying on translations that in many cases are already extant. Translation is a little bit of a distortion. If you look carefully at the English, it's not for they, which is the third person plural. It really should be he, right? The word in Hebrew is ki, masculine singular. For it's really he will turn your children. Now, it's also not in plural. It should be in the singular masculine, for your son, which in this context would mean your grandson. Okay, so let's understand this properly. It says, for he, meaning your son-in-law. It can't be your daughter-in-law, because it would say for she. It would put it in the feminine. And by the way, in Hebrew, there is no neuter gender. Every single noun or pronoun has to be either male or female. So it's binary here. There's no other choice. And it is masculine. So this means that if you have to imagine yourself as a grandparent, if your daughter marries a non-Jewish male, if you as a Jewish person have a daughter who is Jewish and she marries a non-Jewish male, the non-Jewish male, according to this verse, will turn your son, which is your grandson, away from God. That's the statement of the verse here. Let's look at it in the commentary of Rashi. I have it abbreviated on the right here, but let's look at it in greater detail. So Rashi here is quoting the Talmud, Tractate Yevamot 23a, and it reads like this, i.e., the son of the heathen, meaning the non-Jew, when he marries thy daughter, will turn away thy grandson, whom thy daughter will bear unto him, from following me. How you follow God. This teaches us that thy daughter's son, who was born of a non-Jewish father, is still called your son, but your son's son, who is a non-Jewish woman, is not called your son, right? Because the verse only talks about the situation which your grandson by your Jewish son-in-law would go from God. It does not even talking about your grandson from your non-Jewish daughter-in-law, because according to Rashi, quoting the Talmud, that person, that grandchild, not even Jewish. That's the clearest biblical statement of the matrilineal principle. And as you can see, it's not explicit at all. It has to be drawn out through this midrash, which is expressed in the Talmud and expressed later in Rashi's commentary. So that's how the principle is derived. Now, if we take this from a theological perspective, at the very least, the matrilineal principle then is put in place in the period of the giving of the Torah, which is obviously quite ancient. We're now talking about the Exodus period, and would have been, the norm all through ancient Judea. But when we look at the historical data, it's a little more confusing. So, by the way, here's a beautiful painting by Anna Flerovna. She has so many of these studies of women lighting candles with their children looking on. Very kind of traditional, romantic kind of view, but really very powerful. She just passed away in 2020. A very beautiful work, still available for sale in many galleries today. At any rate, we see a biblical narrative that describes how this was actually put into place. So you'll recall that in the 6th century, the Jews are exiled Nebuchadnezzar in the year 586, and then they return within decades from Persia, from Babylonia, to Israel under Ezra. And in chapter 9 of the book of Ezra, he laments. There's a long prayer there where he expresses tremendous regret that so many of the Jews that returned have brought with them their non-Jewish spouses, meaning that intermarriage is rampant. Then in chapter 10, one Shechania ben Yechiel of Elam sends away the foreign wives and their children. He does not, or doesn't mention, what he does with the foreign men. That is, the Jewish men who have married non-Jewish wives, their families are broken up and the wives are sent away along with their children, which seems to be imagine how difficult this might have been and how harsh it must have been. But beyond the sympathy for the human drama involved, it seems like a very clear statement of the matrilineal principle in effect in the 6th century before the Common Era. Now that would be a clear illustration of it. However, as Dr. Cohen points out, when you go 700 years later and you look at non-rabbinic texts, such as the Jewish philosopher Philo, who we'll speak about in a few weeks, God willing, Josephus, who we spoke about extensively, and even Paul. And you have to understand that in some cases, in some ways, the New Testament, the Christian writings, are kind of like a historical commentary on Jewish society as well. So it's very useful to kind of like flesh out what's going on in the first century in some ways. Anyway, all these three important figures and sources, they seem unaware of the matrilineal principle. You have to look in Dr. Cohen's book to see the specific examples, but it seems pretty clear that they're clueless about this. To give you one example, Josephus, he speaks about King Herod the Great, and he goes on and on about how Herod's own pedigree is questioned in the Jewish community. He's called Idumean, he's called the half-Jew, because his father came from the Idumean people who had been forcibly converted prior to this in the era of the Maccabees, the era of the Hashmonaim, under John Hyrcanus in particular. So in other words, because his father descended from a people that had a questionable conversion, there are doubts about Herod's own Jewish identity. But no one seems to be bothered by the fact that his mother wasn't Jewish. His mother was an Arab woman. So what's going on? It's like totally, not relevant, their mother. So now there are ways you can approach this. You can say that Josephus is not necessarily the best, exemplar of rabbinic Judaism at all. And it could be that only the Pharisees were really observing this kind of level of observance that became normative. What Dr. Cohen argues is that in reality, the whole institution of conversion had not really coalesced by this time, and that there was kind of like a different standard for women marrying Jewish men, that their marriage itself constituted the understanding of conversion in that era. Fascinating argument. Whereas men, if they wanted to convert into Judaism, required a much more, complex process, which involved, among other things, circumcision. So that's why when men would marry into Herod's family, then there was a whole big deal about, they went through this and they had the circumcision and so on. But there's no discussion of when non-Jewish women are incorporated into that dynasty. For certain, however, by the time you get to the Mishnah, which is about the turn of the year 200, about the turn of the 3rd century, there's no question that Rabbinic Judaism is absolutely down with the idea of the matrilineal principle, reaffirming what we saw in Rashi quoting the Talmud, which the Talmud, of course, is not going to be written until quite a bit later, but the idea is that matrilineal principle is very, very strong in the Rabbinic tradition, certainly from the Mishnah and onwards. And again, a little theological note here, from the perspective of Orthodox Judaism, the Mishnah, although it only achieves a written form with Yehuda Nasi around the year 200 to 220, it was the embodiment of oral teachings that went back far earlier, and in fact the core teachings of the Mishnah go back to Mount Sinai itself, which corresponds with the way the Talmud read that particular passage in Deuteronomy. Okay, so to wrap this all up, basically we have a matrilineal principle that can arguably be extended all the way back to Mount Sinai through a Pharisaic interpretation of the text. When we look at the actual behavior of Jews, we see that they're not always conforming to this matrilineal principle, sometimes at great cost to themselves, as we see in the book of Ezra, and that even by the 1st century of the Common Era, some very prominent Jews seem to be out of touch with the matrilineal principle. But by the time the Mishnah is codified, this becomes the dominant view, without question, overwhelmingly so, and any deviations from this are taken in a very serious way. I should mention one last caveat that I think is a very important one. We started by talking about how basic this question was. And one of the things that we tend to see in Jewish history is that, Jews can handle a tremendous degree of dissent. There's room for a lot of diverse opinion within the large tent of Jewish identity. But this particular question of whether or not a person is Jewish is one of those third rail type questions that tends to result in fissures, in schisms, and when it remains unresolved, it has very dire consequences for the integrity of the larger Jewish population. But I leave that for people who are, expert in dealing with this. I hope you found this short video useful, and we're going to continue with our discussion of women in ancient Israel. Thank you for watching.
I moved here a year ago. I used to be like, no, they're all human and snowflakes. Fuck you. Stop bleeding on my fucking pizza. And the homeless in Austin, every time I see these motherfuckers, they're getting stronger and stronger.
Over the course of the past few videos, we've had opportunity
going through photosynthesis.
to occasionally talk about specific Jewish women as they appear in ancient Israel in both the biblical context and the larger archaeological context. But let's just take a step back and have kind of a macro look at the methodology of studying women in ancient Israel, the nature of sources, and some of the challenges that are associated with this extremely important topic. One of the ideas that's circulating right now, I think is a very valuable project, is something called the Kranjek test, named after this person, Danielle Kranjek, also pronounced Kanyets. I actually have to contact her to find out which pronunciation they use. But in America, they tolerate Kanyet. At any rate, she actually is trained as a historian, so it was a nice conversation. Her test, which gained a lot of popularity in the Jewish world recently, especially on what we call film Twitter, is inspired by the so-called Bechdel test. The Bechdel test is something that has been used for modern films to sort of purity check the quality of a film from the perspective of a feminist analysis. And that is, in order to pass the Bechdel test, a movie has to have two women speaking with each other about something other than a male character, right? So you would think that this would be a totally normal thing to do, but apparently a lot of films don't pass this. I've seen some other details that suggest that the women should have names, they should be named characters and so on. And obviously the idea is to try and expand the presentation of women, even in something as contemporary as modern film, try to discuss women as real people. Now, Danielle Kranjek takes this a different direction and says that in terms of the study of the Jewish tradition, any source sheet, which is a tried and true pedagogic model where you choose quotes from rabbinic literature, from the Bible, and other things, and put them together on a mimeograph or photocopied sheet, and people will look at these sources. She put that any source sheet that includes at least two texts must also include at least one male identification. It's a very valuable idea to try and expand the simply the universe of our awareness when it comes to rabbinic theologies. And I would love very much to do this because we see that we are living in an era where this incredibly important aspect of the human condition, the experience of women in history, has been, ignored for centuries, and it's so hard to find voices in medieval sources that we really want to try and recreate as much as possible what the experience of as living was for fully half of the human population. We have to live in a cultural moment where this is unusually suppressed as well. I'm sure some of you will be following the controversy regarding the decision of some Jewish papers and media to not publish faces of women. I'm not going to go there for now. Perhaps we will return to it in a semester or two when we get to the 20th century. But I think it is important to point out that this is not at all a uniform practice. It's really on one particular spot on the spectrum. The Lubavitcher Rabbi, who we mentioned in other contexts before, was especially noted for insisting that in any children's book portrayals, such as this Tzivos Hashem handbook for Jewish children, if there is a male child portrayed, there should always be a female child portrayed as well. So this is something that has pushed back on all sectors of the Jewish population, and it's just another example of the Kranjek test kind of expressing itself culturally. When we come to our challenge, which is trying to understand the experience of women in ancient Israel, the difficulty is that the vast majority of our sources are by men, for men, and about men. This is especially true in the literary realm. If we look, for example, at classical rabbinic texts, we have the Mishnah, which on the one hand you say, great, look at this, it has a whole section called Nashim, which is all about women. That should be it, right? But not really, because it's mainly describing how men relate to women, marriage, divorce, levirate marriage, and so on. So women are included in the canon, but at the same time they're kind of fenced off. Another way to look at it is, in the temple courtyard, there was a section called Ezrat Nashim, the courtyard of women. So that means that women were part of the overall functioning of the temple, but on the other hand, there was relegated space for them. By the way, we should also understand there are relegated spaces for all kinds of people who are not Kohanim and not Levian and not involved in sacrifice, things like that. But the point holds true. They are mentioned, they're part of the story, but they're also relative. Our idea is to try to understand their experience in the broader scope of Jewish history. When it comes to archaeological sources, theological sources, finds that you get at digs and so on, they are extremely limited in nature, much more so even than literary sources, and they're incredibly difficult to interpret. As we saw, for example, with the Bar Kokhba caves a while ago, and we'll speak about them a little more, you find cosmetics in a cave, and it's reasonable to assume that medics belong to a woman. Necessarily, if men wore coal, for example, kind of eye makeup. So, what can we really glean from women's history when a lot of sources are anonymized like that? Very difficult to interpret them. You find a bowl, a servant bowl, one may assume perhaps that it was more likely that it belonged to a woman, or a woman was more likely to have handled it, but there's no guarantees on that either. So it's very difficult to actually, on a theoretical level, reconstruct women's experience of history in ancient Israel based on the sources we have. There are some really exciting materials, however, especially when you get to late antiquity. For example, we have the Athena inscription, which comes from Smyrna in the 3rd century, and if you can make out some of the Greek alphabet, they're basically a funerary inscription that describes this woman as an archisynagogus. That's right at the right side of the top line, and then going into the second line is archisynagogus, which means leader of the synagogue. And we actually have quite a few examples of women who are represented with this particular title. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean from the larger context that they were, like, say, the rabbi or even the president of the synagogue. It may mean something like major donor to the synagogue. But nevertheless, these kinds of inscriptions give us a glimpse into perhaps exceptional who were wealthier or more influential, but they definitely had these significant roles, as we shall see much in today's lecture. But as we move forward, I'd like to highlight these in order to try and pass the context test as much as possible. Okay, so let's just look at the biblical text for a minute. Now, one of there are literally thousands of women in the biblical text, to be sure. In many cases, however, they are nameless, or they are named in relationship to men. Like, for example, the wife of Noah, the children of Lot, the daughters of Lot, Jephthah's daughter. We don't know their names from the biblical text, but they are named usually in some kind of relationship to men. Sometimes they're identified in terms of their character or skills, like the wise women of Tekoa, or sometimes based on their place, like the witch of Endor. But there are literally hundreds, thousands of women in the Hebrew scriptures, and we don't know much about them in person. But there's some fascinating aspects when you include the oral tradition as well. Have a look at this picture here. Obviously, it's a piece of Persian art, but you wonder, that looks like a relatively familiar scene, right? It looks like Joseph running away from Aisha Potiphar, the wife of Potiphar, very famous scene, of course, in Genesis, where she's grabbing onto his cloak as he's trying to escape her. And here's another aspect that's really interesting in the Jewish tradition, is that although they may be nameless in the biblical text, the rabbinic tradition preserves the oral tradition in which there are lots of names and lots of additional details. And one of the crucial things about studying the Torah in a Jewish sense is you need to have two fingers. You have to have one finger in the written text and one finger in the oral tradition to understand it, as Jews have for hundreds of years. One easy way to do that is one finger in the text, one finger in Rashi, as we saw, for example, in the last lecture about matrimonial descent. So anyways, why am I bringing up these Persian art? Because in the Persian tradition, there's actually a name. Potiphar Zula is her name. Now, this is not the Jewish oral tradition, although maybe the Muslims are following something from the Jewish oral tradition, who knows. The same phenomenon exists in the sense of there's a lot more detail than you get in the Bible itself. There are many examples in the Bible of strong Jewish women. Typically, they're named when they are strong, and often they're quite strong in the sense of defying male demands. For example, Sarah, who insists on the expulsion of Hagar, and Abraham, when he hesitates, God speaks to him and says, listen to her. The oral tradition actually quotes saying, because why should you listen to her? Because she is a greater prophet than you are. Rebecca, of course, when she decides she knows better than her husband Isaac is the which of her two sons, Esau and Jacob receive the blessing, and in fact, she engineers Jacob's reception of the blessing rather than Esau. Hannah, in Hebrew, it's hard for me to think Hebrew pronunciation. But Hannah, of course, by Eli the Kohen in the book of Samuel, and Hannah stands her ground and says, no, I'm praying to God. And in fact, she becomes the model of our prayer. We even have female warriors, like the woman who killed Sheva ben Bichri, also in the book of Samuel, or Yael, who finds a temple of Isra and saves the people. And those fascinating examples. So, and we have to add in the Bible there are many negative tales of women as well, such as Jezebel and Athaliah. These are complex examples of character that they certainly are smaller in scope than the number of strong male characters, but nevertheless they have depth and sophistication. It's hard to really analyze from a historical perspective.
How you living, Sam? What's good, son?
Theological finds such as the
Hello?
seal that may have belonged to Jezebel.
Can you hear me? How's your day going? Amazing. How'd you find out about me, my friend? Okay. From what Discord? About myself?
Sure.
Rabbi Rothschild. I 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, 300 days a year for world peace. I have more data archived on the internet than any person ever. Do you know of the television or the movie Truman Show?
Yeah, I know it has bro.
All right. Well, then just enjoy yourself. I'm not here for you. I'm watching Jewish history lectures. If you don't want to hear about me, that's fine.
Part we are totally reliant on text, and so therefore the kind of reviews and trying to explore tend to be more literary in nature than historical per se. Nevertheless, we're going to make full use of the text, trying to understand everything we can about them. Let us conclude this discussion with one sort of overarching thing that's really important to understand the experience of women in Israel, and that is that we have to transport ourselves to an early 20th century in which we are increasingly tuned to a more exotic view of religion, to a more ancient view in which there was a very radically different experience of Judaism by men and women. One certainly see echoes of it in the most traditional communities today, the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, but something that would have been pervasive. The next lecture will talk about women, but when we look at women in general in Israel, one of the most important things to really bear in mind is the fact that men and women were not necessarily practicing the same religion. Or maybe I can say it in a little bit better way. They were practicing religion, but there are two different tracks. There's a men's track and a women's track. There's a lot to say about this in terms of religious studies, but in terms kind of an anthropological approach, let's look at this one basic difference between men and women and how they would approach Judaism. The Judaism is, of course, heavily dependent on the interpretation of the commandments. How exactly are these translated to biblical text as mediated by into actual demands on daily life? So one of the ways to categorize the commandment, which by the way would be a major enterprise of the medieval thinkers, and we'll return back in a few months, is to divide them into four different quadrants here. So on the x-axis, we place negative commandments, that is, thou shalt not, things you're not supposed to do, and positive commandments, things that you are supposed to get up and do. And then on the y-axis, we can posit those actions which are defined by time, that is, they're restricted to a particular time, or those which are open-ended and always apply. Let me give you a few examples. Negative commandment, that is defined by time, is no eating bread on the holiday of Passover.
Welcome. Hope you're having a good day.
Lots of other things in the year.
How are you?
The week of Passover, no bread.
Welcome.
How about not
Hope
defined
you're
by
doing
time?
well.
No pork. Thou shalt not, and is not defined by time. Not defined by time would be something like honor your parents. Yeah, when this is no longer a time. What about a cause commandment which is defined by time? Let's say the prayers of Judaism in a fixed window called morning, a window called afternoon, and a fixed window called evening or night. So this is one way you can categorize the commandments. To return to our discussion, women are obligated in three of these categories, but they are exempted positive commandments defined by time. What does that mean, exempt? In general, it means women may choose to do these commandments if they so wish, and they will receive reward for performing these commandments. But if they choose to, they are exempt from performing. There's exceptions to this rule. For example, lighting the candles Friday night, which is something which is specifically associated with women. That is a positive commandment, and it is associated with time. And women are generally considered obligated in that, or women at least are obligated before men are obligated. Another example would be drinking the 4 cups of wine on the holiday of Passover, also a positive commandment defined by time. Women are obligated, and the Talmud goes through a bunch of these exceptions and why they are exceptions, but the general rule is as such. Now, obviously, this has tremendous implications for lifestyle, because one of the most disruptive elements of a day, that's putting it in it's a positive disruption, is prayer 3 times a day. And clearly, for women who are more likely to be overwhelmingly involved in duties of the home, childcare, and things like that, the exemption from positive commandments are defined by time are extremely useful. You can't necessarily run off to shul when you are a skada. There's a lot to say about why women were obligated in this way and not in another way.
What's good? How's your day going?
Doing pretty good. I'm eating a pizza right now.
What kind of pizza?
Yeah.
What kind of pizza?
It's got, you know, like a lot of them.
Oh, okay. Like a meat lover's pizza?
Oh, yeah. Exactly.
Excellent, dog. How'd you find out about me? How'd you find out about me?
I was no boy. I still joined some random DC.
Okay, very well. Was it Ego World?
Oh, yeah.
Excellent.
I think that was
Yeah, no, that's what it is. Okay, very well. What kind of games do you like?
I like games.
Games, okay. How about you, Atomizer?
I play Fighting's.
Okay, what?
Street Fighter 6.
Oh, that's baller. Okay, very well. Do you mind if I tell you about myself?
Sure.
Excellent. I'm Rabbi Rothschild. I stream my life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for world peace. I've been doing so for more than 3.5 years. I have more data archived on the internet than any person ever. I am basically like a real life Truman Show, a real life Big Brother. Have either of you seen movie The Truman Show or the television show?
Are they about like someone being watched 24/7?
So that's essentially what I do. I give people a portal into my life. We've seen the death of a queen, the birth of AI, the coronation of a king, and everything in between. Essentially, the Economist magazine 2018 that data was Earth's #1 resource, more valuable than food, water, air, gold, petroleum, and more data than anyone, which may make me an influential person someday. And if that happens, I'm going to make you, your friend, all exceptionally wealthy if you're not already. I'm going to financial independence if you don't already. I'm going to make sure that you have the ability to have generational wealth if you don't already. And most of all, to give you enough money to be able to lead some philanthropic organization own. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Excellent. Attending world hunger through the use of technology, such as agricultural drones, floating greenhouses, saltwater.
What do you think of Trump?
I talk about things like anything. My friend, if you don't shut up, I'm going to. I tend to end world hunger through the use of technology such as agricultural drones, greenhouses, saltwater greenhouses, things farming, hydroponics, cloud seeding. I want to help end world thirst. I'm sponsored by cryptocurrency. With over $100 million. One of the things that we do is we build wells in developing nations such as Nigeria for the less fortunate. I am an advocate for the use of life straws and most importantly desalination technology, where we pump earth seawater onto land and make it drinkable. How do those things sound to you?
Oh, they sound good.
Excellent. I talk about other things. Excellent. I appreciate that. I talk about to help the world, but also that people find interesting topics like futurology, things faster than light communication, things like space tourism, space terraforming of other planets, intergalactic travel, things like quantum computing, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence. I talk about things like de-extinction technology. Specifically, people don't know this, but the first successful de-extinction took place in the year 2003 with the Pyrenean ibex, which was a goat located in northern Spain. So fast forward to the year 2021, a company out of Dallas, they've made it their that within the next 3 years to reintroduce the woolly mammoth into the Arctic Circle, utilizing Asian elephant surrogates. I'm a major advocate of this type of technology. Additionally, I'm an advocate for their next plan, which is to de-extinct the Tasmanian tiger, followed by the dodo bird. They made headlines recently with their introduction of the dire wolf. I think this is just a fascinating project that they have. I talk about other things to help you, your friends, your family, things like life extension technology. When you all were born, the average life expectancy for you was probably about age 80 years old. I'm going to increase that to age 100, 120 through the use of technology such as agricultural drones, floating greenhouse, not agricultural drones and floating greenhouses, but those certainly can help life extension technology. But things more like peptides, human growth hormone stems, cold shock therapy, red light therapy, ambrosia therapy, things like nootropics, things like cryogenics to get you to 120 years old. But at that age, you may say, like, it's been a really great run. What's the next plan? And this is again with your consent. You may be able to utilize a type of technology known as mind uploading tissue, where we scan your brain into a computer like a CAT scanner and MRI, knowing where every atom is in your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system for later download as an android, an avatar, a cyborg, a cybernetic being, a clone of yourself, a robot, an ethereal being. you want to be. But essentially, what I'm saying to you is that you may have the opportunity at digital immortality in the future. What are your thoughts?
That's pretty cool.
So that's what I do. What are your hobbies?
I play video sports,
Okay, excellent. What sports?
basketball.
Okay, very well. You're playing soccer. You like to score?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. How did you score this past season?
Past season about 5.
Okay, and what position you play in basketball?
I'm a center.
Oh, wow. All right, big dog. All right, and how many points do you average a game?
Around 10.
Okay, very well.
Don't use big dog here. That's species language.
All right, so if I may ask, how old are you?
14.
All right, you've got to leave. I'm 18 years old to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you. Take care, man.
The rabbinic formulation after the sociological realities, or the other way around. I will leave that with enthusiasm to people who are
what's going on?
Religious studies, women's studies, and so on. But nevertheless, this is the
What's good, son?
How's
your day going?
Experience in the ancient world and for traditional communities.
Yellow. How's your day going? Yo, Sack, the Basques. How's your day going? Oh, I hope it's going well. We're just watching Jewish history lectures. Feel free to enjoy.
The medieval world and even into the modern world when you see the more orthodox communities. There are also, beyond this, specific experiences that women would have had that tend to be more biological in nature, like, for example, the regular visits to the mikvah, the immersion pool, and one of the most beautiful things that have been resurrected in the early modern period is the composition of specific prayers that are associated with women's experience of the commandments, such as going to the mikvah, experiencing menopause, childbirth, things like that, which are largely disappeared from the regular canon of text because they were primarily guarded by men. A lot more to say of this, but we'll have to move forward into the future. So these kinds of religious structural elements help define many of the traditional divisions between men and women and their experience of Judaism and the world as a whole. Women tend to be relegated to the private sphere of the home, but not at all exclusively. We have lots of interesting examples of women extending into the public sphere. Women tend to be involved in particular crafts such as the production of clothing, very, very time-consuming work, the production of the care of the diet of the family, and so on. Again, no way to say, appropriate to say this was universal, but it's certainly reliable to say that it was more common than not. In the next lecture, I'd like to look at 3 exceptional women, 2 of which are exceptional because of their accomplishments, and the third who is exceptional because we simply happen to know a lot about her, and otherwise she may have been an absolute average woman, and I'll give you some sense of what it must have been like for life in their cases in the 1st and 2nd century. I hope you found this video. Thank you very much for watching.
This 5-star Dallas, and he does builds. He did. What are you talking about? He's like, I don't know, what are you doing? Dude, I'm also doing Roush stuff. And he goes, the cool thing is sold at warranty too. I said, say less, because I've learned
Okay, and now that we've had a look at one specific issue, that of matrilineal descent, and then we looked a little bit at some of the sources and methods, challenges of studying Jewish women in antiquity. Let's look at three exceptional examples, and we'll hope to learn from these examples some kind of contrast to the average women in general society. It's not a very precise way of doing things, but it's very difficult to work with the nature of the sources that we have before us today. Hopefully, moving forward, to some degree in the medieval period, but certainly when we get to the early modern period, we'll be able to explore women's lives with much more dependence on their actual voices. But let's have a look at the three examples that will give us some sense of what it must have been like to be a woman in antiquity. These three women were actually suggested in a book by Rothschild, who was a very important archaeologist who did some amazing work in the Cave of Letters and in other places. This is the book, by the way, that is really quite fascinating, called Digging Through the Bible, Modern Archaeology, and the Ancient Bible. And he suggests these three characters. I also want to mention that he was someone who pioneered the use of colonoscopy tools in exploring hard-to-reach caves, right? Because the doctor suggested that's a great way to get into hard-to-reach places. And I have to mention that he has a striking resemblance to another famous archaeologist. I can't quite put my finger on who it might be, but there's a sort of, oh my gosh, I wish I graduated school. I studied so many things about archaeology. He suggested at the life of Gloria as an unusual woman of the 2nd century of late antiquity. It's much harder to get back earlier in time, as we've discussed. But what do we know about Gloria? Well, first of all, she was mentioned frequently in the Talmud. She's the wife of a very important rabbi, Rabbi Meir. She comes from an important family. Her father was Hanani ben Zeradia, one of the martyrs of the Adrianic persecution that was related to the Bar Kokhba war. So that helps us date Gloria, besides Rabbi Meir, her father was a son of her lifetime, from the 2nd century. We know from the Talmudic that her sister was actually taken off to captivity to Rome, although the point has some thoughts as well. Now, one of the fascinating things about her work is that she is so exceptional in that she is mentioned frequently in the Talmud as a sage. Let us understand that there are about 2,000 different Amoraim, or later rabbinic figures in the period of the Talmud, who actually have a named voice in this massive document. And there can't be more than 20 women who appear anywhere. And most of these women are unnamed, or they have a title like Matronisa, something like that. Gloria stands out so much as being an incredibly important woman in the actual intellectual give and take of this massive document. She often corrects the sages who respect her learning, and she often does it in a way that has kind of like a biting sense of humor. Like in one particular example, when she is by another rabbi in a rather polite manner, and she snaps back at him saying, Galilean fool, he happened to come from the Galileo. Did you not read what it says? And she quotes another teaching, do not talk over much with women. You should have abbreviated your statement to me and simply say which way to look, right? In other words, she's sort of throwing the teaching of the rabbi back at them. And you get this sense that sometimes there is kind of like a proto-feminist critique in the things that she says. But that's a minor aspect of teaching. Her life story and the kind of things that she talks about are often profound and very, she speaks to the nature of personal tragedy in life, as we see with his father, his sister, and also with children of Rabbi Meir, who died, particularly Sabbath, through some terrifying kinds of things. That's the and she's really a teacher of phenomenal depth, of halakhic wisdom, acerbic wit, and perspicacity. An amazing woman, and she stands out primarily as kind of like the big exception to the rule of women who are silent, who are nameless or voiceless. The end of her life is described in a bizarre passage that is recorded 1,000 years after her life in the commentary of Rothschild on the tractate of Zara. It doesn't occur anywhere else in literature, and although it appears in a very authoritative commentary, that of Rashi, a great sage, nevertheless, it's so out of character with what we know about Rabbi Meir's life and what we know about Bruria's life, but it describes her as being very ignoble. I think scholars to debate over that particular story. Now, Bruria stands out one tremendous counter is the vast majority of women to Torah learning that was a territory of her life and activity. So that's an exception in terms of the realm of scholarship, which of course would be extremely important in the development of Jewish society over the next millennia. Another very important figure now in terms of politics would be a figure known as Berenice. She was actually royalty in the literal sense. Her name was really Berenice. Her dates are somewhere around the year 26 to the year 85. She was the daughter of King Agrippa and his wife Sixtus. Now, you will recall puppet kings in the Roman were very powerful, like Herod the Great, who was a great grandfather, if I calculate correctly, and others were. So the first was runner ladder category. He had to be a more sympathetic figure, usually in a positive light, from the year 41 to 44. As royal Jewish prince, she was married off for purposes of women and connection, things like that, to one who was the son of Alexander Lysimachus of Alabar of Alexandria, essentially the leader of the Jewish community there. And now that he was the nephew of a very famous Jewish philosopher, though he will speak about that in another lecture. She was, and then she remarried Herod Polio Alcis, widowed a second time, and then she went and she essentially moved in with her brother Agrippa II. Josephus, in this context, reports a really nasty relationship, rumor about the two of them, which is unusual because it is not repeated by Roman historians of the time. It's not impossible because this was not an unknown practice among the Romans, but for Jews it would have been extremely scandalous, to say the least. But anyway, at this she was at the peak of authority. She was referred to as Regina or Regina, meaning queen, Basileia, also queen, and she actually served faithfully in the trial of Paul later on in this capacity. We had a look at she married a third time to King Polonius II of Cilicia, who actually converted to Judaism and was circumcised and so on. But here's another fascinating thing about it. She was in Jerusalem at the time of the outbreak of the revolt, that being in year 66. And she was there because she was fulfilling a Nazarite vow. Context, and Nazarite is something that's recorded in the Bible. This is a whole tractate of atonement. In which basically a person some kind of like moving experience, and they want to like do repentance for it. They want to do true for it, and so they undertake some restrictions on their behavior, let their hair grow, refrain from alcohol specifically, and then at the end of this period, which is limited, usually 30 days, or 60 days, they come to Jerusalem, and then they offer a sacrifice. So she was there at that time when the broke out. It's just kind of sense of what kind of person she would be. And she stood up for the rebels. She went to Gessius Florus, the procurator, who was unsympathetic to the Jews, and she appeared before him barefoot for mercy for it, but she was unable to stop either the Roman plot, and she was unable to the rebel hunter. He ended up fleeing Jerusalem when the palace of her brother was burned down. And somehow in this context of this involved in a relationship with none other than Titus, that is the son of the emperor Vespasian, later to become emperor himself, who was responsible for the armies that would destroy the There's some interesting thoughts about what this relationship must have been like. Many of the classical historians point to her tremendous beauty. She and her sister were regarded as among the most beautiful women of the Eastern Mediterranean. Titus himself had some dozen years her age. That himself would have been unusual. Others point to very unequal relationship between Titus as a of a elite conquered people, so that this relationship might have been more of a interpretation. Her relationship with Titus, allowing the scholarly refuge in Yavne to persist. We recall that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai famously asked for a retreat so the sages could stay somewhere safe and not participate in the revolt and not be destroyed, and this was granted. So Dr. Freund argues, interestingly enough, that maybe it was Berenice's relationship with the teachers that allowed this to happen, and if that is the case, then of course she contributed to the survival of Judaism and the Jewish people as a whole. Her relationship with Titus was somewhat stormy. It was viewed by many as quite scandalous, and ultimately she was forced out of Rome, and Titus died shortly thereafter in the year 79. So she's a fascinating and exceptional individual in the sense that she's at the very top of society. She is involved in things that royalty are involved with. It's marriages for setting relationships. She's involved in the highest levels of government, speaking with emperors, and she deals with huge political aid for the revolt. But this is clearly in contrast to the vast majority of women who left no trace on the political record. But it is worthy to note that it is in a romantic relationship that is a real mark on art history as well. The relationship of Berenice and Titus has been celebrated in a number of works, literary, musical, including La Canto, the Mercy of Titus by Wolfgang Mozart, a famous opera. Her role in the relationship has been celebrated in Western civilization far outside the Jewish awareness of it. Let us now turn to our final exceptional individual. We looked at Gloria as an example of exceptionality in that she was such a renowned scholar. Berenice, because of her high level of political activity, now we have a woman who is exceptional in that suddenly gets a huge amount of detail about her personal life, although otherwise she would be unknown to us. Now, speaking about a woman named Rabbi, I'm only going to speak for a few minutes right now, but I would have a look at works on her by Dr. Hannah Cotton, by Dr. Freund, and others. I also have an hour-long lecture on Babata that goes into this in much more detail. She was one of the people hiding with the Bar Kokhba rebels in the case in the Dead Sea region. We spoke about a couple of videos ago. And she may have died there. One of the human remains, female remains, would have been associated with her. There were women and children in these caves. But it's likely that she did die there because she left behind this pouch, which contained a trove of nearly 20 documents that all linked to her personal legal history. And by investigating these documents, they're written in a variety of languages, Hebrew, and they all speak to her extensive legal battle. In these legal battles, she saved these documents. Also, too, she was deeply involved in these battles that had to do with different issues, study that her parents, and also property that one of her two husbands left to her. That second husband had a co-wife, right? So they were in a polygamous relationship, not unheard of at that time. And she was disputing with her co-wife over orchard of plums, things like that, and also had children who the court had a tropai, or the custodial officer, who was seeking to get and wrested from the court. And so, this is not to go into the ins and outs of the specifics of her arguments, portray her as, very much in charge of her own life. Not clear whether or not she was even illiterate in these languages. She may have had scribes, involved in drawing them up and so on, but she clearly knew what it meant because she put them all together in this pouch, and she treasured them like, I have the family documents like passports and things like that, in a special little box and things like that. These are very valuable documents for her life and activity, and it gives us a sense. The woman in the 2nd century who was not without means. She was probably like upper middle class, dealing with property issues and so on, who took charge of her life, and she was really an agent involved in her life. So we should not imagine, by Babaka's example, that the vast majority of women were passive and allowing kind of life to wash over them and being passed from man to man in various ways. This is a woman who's deeply involved in fighting for her life and finding some success from time to time. There are some interesting questions. Why was she there with the Bar Kokhba rebels herself? It's possible that she feared the general destruction that was going on with the Romans. There's one particular figure who appears to have linked her to Bar Kokhba, because he's also mentioned in terms of the Bar Kokhba command, so perhaps it was a familiar relationship. We really don't know, but we get a sense of an average woman who has a very, very important, detailed legal history, like many of us do even today. And so this is a corrective to the huge silence that we get from the sources on in general. So she's exceptional, not so much in what she did with her life, but we know a lot more about her life, and it reveals some fragments. Many more factual things to be learned, I'm sure, and analyze about the archive with grade. Okay, I hope you found this video useful. We're definitely going to be in more and more discussion of Jewishness into the lectures as we move forward in time. But the next series of lectures are going to deal with the Jewish diaspora in Antiquity. Okay, thank you very much.
Off for years at the lower level to get to there. So there's a big difference. So stopping this fight was probably the right. For an influencer, he looks damn good. Most of these guys,
At this point, it makes sense to pause and sort of think a little bit about your transition that happened in color, the experience of Jews and the globe. That is, of course, the diaspora. The term diaspora is Greek in origin, and it means something like scattering, and it refers to the spreading out of Jews into the Mediterranean basin and Mesopotamia and eventually throughout the world. Now, this has been the Jewish experience for the last 2,000 years. It's only been dramatically altered with the establishment of the State of Israel in the middle of the 20th century. So really we're speaking about the biggest chunk of Jewish history in the post-biblical period has been all in diaspora, and Jews negotiated their reality politically, socially, economically, and so on as a minority in majority cultures. And that certainly had a lot to say about what kind of people the Jews would become. Now we should note, of course, that the term that was used internally within the Jewish world, at least until the 19th century in particular, was not diaspora, which has kind of like a neutral connotation, but it was exile. In Hebrew, it was galut, or in a Ashkenazi pronunciation, galut. exodus, that Jews were thrown out of their land. Um, and this is a little bit of a misnomer because although there was tremendous devastation and suffering in the way of construction of the temple, and there was an expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem in particular, they were not expelled from the land in the first century, like with the also limited population transfers that happened in the Assyrians and Babylonians. They were, let's say, highly encouraged to leave by the desperate conditions. In some cases, there were tens of thousands taken off into slavery, but the concept of expelling all the Jews from their land is something that really wasn't, reasonable in the ancient world at all. So there was a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, sometimes an incredibly small population, but nevertheless, Jews always did maintain some kind of physical presence in the land of Israel throughout the long millennia of diaspora. However, the majority of the Jewish population soon found themselves outside of the boundaries of Israel, hence the experience as an exile. It's really pointing out, not in this particular series, but just in one sentence, that the concept of exile on a theological level pertains even when the Jews have a state, meaning theologically, Jews consider themselves in exile, even if they're still Jerusalem today. The concept that until Messiah comes, there will be a diasporic or an exilic condition pertaining to Jewish existence. But at any rate, let's take some of our time and look at both before the destruction of the temple and maybe a little bit after the destruction of the temple before we move into the medieval period. This is a map that gives you of the diaspora that talks about it. The first Roman-Jewish war in the year 70 resulted in the destruction of the temple in that year, and ultimately fall of Masada. And as we shall see, there was a definite dispersion of Jews within Israel itself, but the Jews settling throughout the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia centuries earlier. On this map, you see the kind of the Mediterranean referred to the greatest extent of the century, and that Rabbi city indicates that there was a Jewish population in the second century. Have a look at Israel closer here, and you can see that the hatching shows that there was a Jewish settlement along the coast, a little bit towards the northern Negev, and heavily based in the Galilee to the north, and also a little bit in the Jordan Valley on both sides of the river in the Perea region as well. But conspicuous by its absence, of course, is the region around Judea, which is emptied of Jews because of the Roman attacks on the Bar Kokhba rebels and the destruction of Jewish villages there. A lot of Jewish population moved in particular north to where the new center would exist, and Jews were in fact banned from Jerusalem at this time as well. The Romans also changed the name of the land. This is when it received the Latin term Palestina, which was intended to refer to the biblical enemies of Jews in the land of Israel, the Philistines, and so renaming the region Palestina was meant to try and, in terms of cartography, wipe Israel off the map, so to speak. It is ironic, of course, that the term has been revived as a political term. It has always been a geographic term since the Roman Empire. Jews were also living in Mesopotamia, that is this region here, framed by the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into the Persian Gulf. We'll look at that in the next lecture. And then there's a certain amount of Jews who are living in the Italian and in the Greek peninsula, and in the Minor as well, Eastern Mediterranean. We also have Jews who are living in the coast of North. We looked at one of those communities, in the context of the Kutos rebellion. a while ago, and there are even Jews as far west as the Iberian Peninsula and the south of France as well. So we're going to look at all of these colorful breaches. But the main center of the Jewish diaspora in this period of time was undoubtedly a very, very important place where Jews had been living literally for centuries. There was a long connection between Israel and Egypt after the Exodus. The Bible just many relations between Egypt and Israel, from hostile and quite often not hostile. For example, King Solomon marries a princess. Isaiah refers to communities in Lower Egypt. Jeremiah spent some time there unwillingly, as happens after the event of Gedalia, a fast day after Rosh Hashanah every year. The Jews were primarily concentrated in the south, in the earliest town, Elephantine. I always pronounce that, by the way, Elephantine. I looked a little more carefully. It's supposed to be pronounced Elephant. Maybe someone in the comments will me if I get that wrong. This is known as the Upper Nile. Even though it is on the bottom of the map, as I think I mentioned to you earlier,
What's
the Nile, of course, flows
is done.
Empties.
Yeah, River. Doing a breakdown, big dog. Like, we'll get there, girls.
South is called the Upper Nile. Downriver is the lower.
Here we go.
Have,
I don't know if you're seeing me like this. There's some rabbits who be like, go ahead, rabbits. What's up, peephole? I'd be like, what? She'd be like, you wear sideways, now you're peephole. She'd be like, hey, where did you get those sick ass earbuds? I'd be like, girl, come down. She'd be like, no, they're headphones, whatever. The ones on the string. Anyway, like my stethoscope.
A satellite view
Calm down, baby. Anyway,
power of the Nile. And down at the very southwest, the little red mark, there are some cataracts, which means that the river constricts and it loses its depth, and ships moving
on behalf of the rebels in the middle. Where did you get those sick ass
unload their cargo or negotiate the rapids or put it on the land in a kind of portage situation?
These are one of the kind of all of my possessions. These
any kind of transition. That's where the robbers would lie in wait and so on. It makes sense to have some
ever. You know
about this community
of anything that I have.
The records
these are the things I want the most. I think.
We know that the Jews had a temple there.
So give us a breakdown. What's going on, big dog? It's a while since we've spoken.
Pretty clear about prohibiting any other temples outside of Jerusalem.
Yeah, I like your little
man bun. Others in existence.
You're looking like Gordon. Yeah.
All right. Discussing the Second Temple period, which is Nablus and modern terminology.
Earwax.
That would be the Samaritan temple, of course, where the Jews consider, of course, valid. The Iraq El Amir.
Eat your earwax and told you. No, not usually.
In Egypt.
Calm down. Anyway. Oh, they just been what's new?
What is going on in those temples?
Yeah, did you schedule all the reminders for the season for Yeah, did you schedule all your reminders for all the other sports? Yeah. How about for college football? Yeah, everything. Well, I meet all the scheduling now. Is that the end of your story? So
homes and things like that.
Last night, I had a ton of people who came in all at once. And I'm like, hey, how'd you find out about me? And they were like,
she was married 3 times, first to a Jewish soldier,
on
and then apparently
and then one person said the clip from Twitter. Do you believe them?
Maybe there were local authorities or something in the region.
That's tight. Because I just inundate kick with clips. It's like you go to like any creator and It's like
married an Egyptian slave named Tammuz.
that doesn't really do
Tammuz
that
is
much. Right?
definitely
It
not
does
a
some.
Hebrew
I
name,
get more people from that band.
because
I really
Tammuz
think
means you will die.
Twitch,
Right? That's probably
yeah,
not a
Rabbit's
good
the
name
middle.
for your daughter.
Yeah,
So,
Rabbi.
the fact that he's
I know I've been
marrying
quiet
an
for a lot
Egyptian
of this,
slave is in
and
itself
if you're watching, you're probably
but
watching them,
you
and I'm
also
feeling
from
like
the
really
documents
vocal at the
that
beginning.
in
Anyway,
fact he wasn't even
but
completely married to her in Jewish sense.
what
That certainly does not follow
ask
any
myself
of
this
the
question: What's the
laws
difference between the
described in
rabbits in the
Talmud,
back and rabbits in
because
the middle?
she was simultaneously owned
Anyway,
by a different man, the
rabbits in the
master,
middle. Go ahead.
someone named
Yes, I was
Shubha,
going
which
to
is
go.
also a
Anyway,
Jew.
so
And
you were
he
going,
owned
and you
their
were
son,
talking,
whose
blah
name
blah
was
blah.
Pilti. If
Anyway,
Ananya
you were
to default
Wow, big dog.
owner
I'd be
of the
like,
slave
it's a
woman,
great to really.
the whole
That's
thing
why I
was
asked
really
the big
bizarre.
man.
Also
And I
interesting
said,
though, again,
and then rabbits in the back.
there's not
Yeah,
lots more to say about that.
Blue sky. It's other shit that we've been witnessing the last 3.5 years. It's going to be 4 years.
Families, existence in Elephantine, and
Link up that
fascinating
time,
like
something
discoveries of the actual site of the
maybe like
temple itself.
mid.
Another major
I have
Jewish
before
settlement
Yeah.
is Alexandria, which of course is a big city today.
What do you guys want?
In the western
Rabbits
part
in the back.
of
Give us
now
a breakdown of the draft,
Baltimore
big dog.
City, is here, right
And where'd
on
you
the
get
coast.
those headphones? I'd be like,
The
calm down.
Jews of
Of all
Alexandria
my
go
possessions,
back
you don't.
centuries and centuries. In the
Keep
3rd
it,
century
calm
before
down,
the Common
woman.
Era, Jews
What
were
jersey?
involved in
Yeah,
translating the
rabbits in the middle.
Bible.
Yeah, what jersey did you wear? Be like, huh? Yeah, don't they give you jerseys? What color did you get? Be like, calm down, woman. You don't want the jersey. It's like hysterical how fucked up that situation still is.
Church. There's a funny story about
Oh my god.
Septuagint was written according to the legend.
All right.
70 rabbis were
here
put
we
in, and they were all put in 70 different
You ready
rooms,
for a draft
given the
breakdown?
Bible and told to
We're all
translate
ready.
it.
That's
And they
enough.
all came out
Yeah.
and compared
Okay.
what they had done.
Here we go.
And they had all written the exact same translation.
So we're just gonna
All
start at the beginning. Yeah, rabbits in the back. Yeah, did you update your ESPN teams like
very important.
the WNBA, the MLB,
like to joke that you
the-
call that a miracle? That's not a miracle.
NFL already?
If you get 70
So we gotta
rabbis
do a draft
together,
pick 'em. So
you
before we
put
go to
in
the
one room,
before we
and
go to
ask them
the
be
not the
honored.
draft pick 'em, but just the
That's
pick 'em.
a miracle.
Yeah, rabbits in the back. Yeah. How'd you do in college football? I'm like, oh, it's 5
By
and
the
5.
first century,
Anyway.
the Jews were quite numerous in Alexandria, and they had one neighborhood, specifically
Super
the Jewish
excited about
neighborhood,
that.
and they had a second one out of 5. But there was a significant amount of
Anyway.
controversy with the local Greek
All right.
population.
Let's
You
do
recall that
NFL
Alexander
pick'em
the
first.
Great had swept through the entire region and had
All right.
established
Where-
all kinds
where is it?
of norms, and these Alexandria.
Let's do college football. Okay.
And
Are
there
you
are a lot
gonna
of
do the
people
thing
who
where we
had
can see the thing?
privileges
It
under
gets so
the-
hard. Do it this way, and I'm sure you just see it like
But
this.
when the Romans came,
You can see it on the sky
they
cam.
were not happy
Anyway,
with the displacement.
I'm the
of
193rd thousandth in the country. That's fucking amazing. In the
Jews,
world,
on
I
the
think,
other hand,
actually.
saw it as
But it's better to be
for
best
them
in the country. Ask
to
anybody. We are in the country.
privileges in
Fuck
society.
the
And so
country,
Jews actually
baby.
welcomed the
All right, here we
Romanovs
go.
when they arrived in the middle
Iowa,
of the
Iowa
first
State.
before the Common Era. We have a fascinating description.
Fuck Iowa State.
A major
Fuck that whole
upheaval
state.
against
That whole
the Jews
state
in the year
sucks.
38, which some have called
All right.
actually the first
UConn.
This was
Wait,
reported by
we're
the
doing this.
philosopher Philo,
Like
very important figure
the
of
thing?
the era, who approached the
We're just
Bible
picking who's
primarily
gonna
in
win.
Greek sense.
Where's the thing where it tells
Philo
you
was extremely important in
10%
introducing
pick? Why doesn't it do it on the other
philosophical
thing?
way to understand
All right,
the
10%
Bible.
pick.
He did
Iowa?
not get that much
Dude,
in
fuck Iowa State.
tradition.
I don't give a
Did
shit.
not write
You never
Hebrews,
pick Iowa
wrote-
State. Those fuck.
And many of the
All right.
texts were really contrary to what the rabbis were talking.
Whatever's in
But
Iowa
nevertheless,
City, those men
extremely
suck.
influential
I think
once again,
Ames,
Christian
that
tradition,
sucks too.
not so much.
Anyway,
At
UConn.
any rate,
So we're going to rain on that.
this first upheaval as the result of
All
the
right.
tension between
UConn
the
or
Greek
Syracuse?
and the Jewish relations in the
Dude,
city
orange
that were
sucks,
in
but
particular when
that's
Kepler
on
the
Steam,
First,
so
you
we'll go with
remember
that.
him, he ruled in
The fighting
he
has got to be the
visited
best
region.
Illinois
Jews
squad in
locally
like
asked
ever.
him if he would maybe
And ever?
intercede
And
with his
ever,
friends in
ever,
Rome on their
ever,
behalf,
ever. All right.
He chose
SMU, Baylor,
a gaudy parade through the
Can't see it.
of
Dude,
Alexandria.
lady, shut the fuck up.
Greek rivals
All right.
Jews actually mounted sort of a mock
Virginia
counter
or
in which they
Wolfpack?
openly
Oh,
made fun
close
of.
to-
Sure
All right.
enough,
Is it?
they
No, but what the
translated
fuck's
it
a Cavalier?
violence.
Cleveland Cavalier? Knight or something?
Who had his
Oh,
issues
shit.
with
All right,
Rome. He
dude,
was a
these
Roman
games
official.
suck
There was a
dick
change
this
of
week.
guard
Last week it was
with
like
Rome,
pow,
his
pow, pow,
similar
pow. This
position,
week it's like
and he
Iowa
decided to take
State.
the side of the
Snorefest.
Greeks.
All right.
And
West Virginia,
he ordered, among
Ohio.
other things, the
I don't
Jews
think.
should be
Okay, West
limited to
Virginia.
one neighborhood, not to two.
Michigan or
Forced
Oklahoma.
concentration of
Or
Jews
Sooner,
in one of
baby.
those two neighborhoods, which
Arizona
some would
State
argue
or
actually
Mississippi
constituted
State.
the world's
They
first
have a thing.
ghetto.
What is it? What do they do?
Idea.
This or
Was
something?
also occasioned by significant
Sun
anti-Jewish violence and attacks on synagogues, which was
Vanderbilt or
really an unusual
Virginia
thing
Tech?
for the ancient
I
world.
guess
Synagogues were
Vanderbilt.
generally considered,
All right.
places where
What?
you
How many
should not
points will
transgress
Oklahoma
and respect
60?
the various
Okay,
ritual
that one's
worship
done.
of other
Dude, I don't
groups.
want to do
But
it
this
this
was
way.
one
It
of those
sucks.
occasions where that was ignored. The
Everything
new
sucks.
emperor, however,
All right, how about
laid down
now?
the law and established the status
what's
quo,
this one?
where the Jews were mollified,
All right,
but there would be
five,
yet
oh,
again
this one.
violence in the
We
year
went 4 and 6
66,
on this one.
probably in connection
What
with
is this? This is
the
against the spread.
War that exploded
Texas
in
is going to come out
So that's
just
just a look
guns
very quickly at
blazing.
Alexandria. And
Texas
as a
Tech.
whole, Egypt played
48
a
and
very
a half
important
point.
role
Like, who
in the
fucking-
early diaspora.
Dude,
Thank you
who
very
knows?
much.
Who knows? Oh, you're going to beat Kent State by 48 and a half, and then it'll be like a 49-point game. I don't fucking know how these motherfuckers do this.